Submission is survival. Obedience is honor. Defiance is death. That's what every wolf in the Moonshadow Pack learned from birth. That's what Kale's father whispered to him when he was just a pup, trembling under the weight of an alpha's glare. That's what the elders chanted during every blood moon ceremony, their voices echoing through the ancient stone halls of the pack's ancestral court. But Kyle would learn that some wolves were born with fire instead of fear in their veins. And when you refused to bow to the most powerful alpha in 5 territories, when you stood tall while his command crashed against you like waves against an unbreakable cliff, you didn't just defy a man, you shattered an empire. This is the story of the wolf who said no, the wolf who made an alpha fall, the wolf who proved that sometimes the greatest strength isn't in the power to command, but in the courage to resist. And it all began on the day Kyle was dragged into the Grand Court in chains, accused of a crime he didn't commit, standing before an alpha who had never been told no in his entire life. Chapter 1. The Shadow in the Pack. Kyle had always been invisible. Not literally, of course. He had a body, lean, wiry, with dark hair that fell into eyes the color of storm clouds. He had a face, sharp cheekbones, a jaw that clenched too often, lips that rarely smiled. He had hands, calloused from years of work in the pack's forge, scarred from hot metal and hotter tempers. But in the Moonshadow Pack, where bloodlines determined destiny and strength determined worth, Kyle might as well have been a ghost. He was Omega-born, the lowest rank, the weakest link, the wolf that existed to serve, to submit, to disappear into the background while alphas and betas strutted through life with their heads held high and their futures guaranteed. "Kale, where the hell is my armor?" The voice cut through the forge like a whip crack. Kale didn't flinch. He'd learned long ago that flinching only made things worse. Instead, he set down the sword he'd been sharpening and turned to face the source of the demand. Dmitry Volkov. Beta-born, third in line to the pack's ruling family, and the closest thing Kyle had to a personal tormentor. Dmitry stood in the doorway of the forge, backlit by the afternoon sun, his golden hair practically glowing like some kind of divine halo. He was tall, taller than Kyle by at least 4 inches, and built like a warrior from the old stories. Broad shoulders, thick arms, a chest that strained against his tailored tunic. Everything about him screamed power, privilege, perfection. Everything about him made Kale's wolf snarl quietly in the back of his mind. "Your armor isn't ready yet," Kale said, his voice flat and emotionless. He'd perfected this tone over the years, not defiant enough to provoke punishment, not submissive enough to invite cruelty, just empty. "You brought it in yesterday with a cracked breastplate and 2 broken straps. It takes time to—" "I don't care about excuses, Omega." Dmitry stepped into the forge, his boots heavy against the stone floor. "The Alpha's son is hosting a hunt tomorrow morning. Do you have any idea what it means to be invited to hunt with Rhaegar Silverclaw?" Kyle did, actually. Rhaegar Silverclaw was the Alpha's eldest son, heir to the Moonshadow Pack, and the most powerful wolf under 30 in 5 territories. He was everything an Alpha should be: strong, ruthless, charismatic, utterly unbeatable in both combat and command. When Rhaegar issued an order, wolves obeyed. When Rhaegar looked at you, you felt the weight of ancient power pressing against your very soul. Kale had seen Rhaegar exactly twice in his entire life, both times from a distance. Both times Kale had felt something strange twist in his chest, something that wasn't quite fear, wasn't quite awe, but lived somewhere in the dangerous space between. "I know what it means," Kale said quietly, "but I can't make metal bend faster than physics allows. Your armor will be ready by tomorrow evening at the earliest." Dimitri's eyes flashed. In an instant, he crossed the space between them and grabbed Kale by the front of his shirt, slamming him back against the workbench. Tools clattered to the floor. The sword Kale had been sharpening fell with a ringing clang. "You don't tell me what you can't do," Dmitry hissed, his face inches from Kale's. His breath smelled like expensive wine and entitlement. "You're Omega. You do what you're told, when you're told, or you get reminded of your place. Understand?" Kale's wolf growled louder now, pushing against the mental barriers he'd spent years constructing. His hands twitched at his sides. It would be so easy. One punch, one moment of letting the rage win, 1 second of treating Dimitri the way Dimitri treated everyone beneath him. But that would mean punishment. That would mean the pit, the underground cell where defiant wolves were thrown to learn respect. That would mean whip marks and broken bones and weeks of recovery. So Kale did what he always did. He went quiet. He went still. He let his eyes go blank and his body go limp. "I understand," he whispered. Dimitri held him for 1 more second, just long enough to make his point, then released him with a disgusted shove. "Good. Have it ready by noon tomorrow, or I'll make sure the Alpha hears about your incompetence." He turned and strode out of the forge without another word, leaving Kale standing there with his heart pounding and his wolf snarling and his hands shaking with suppressed fury. This was Kale's life. This had always been Kale's life. But what Kale didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as he returned to his work with clenched fists and burning eyes, was that in exactly 48 hours, everything would change. Because in 48 hours, someone would be found dead in the Alpha's private quarters, and Kale would be accused of murder. The pack house sat at the heart of the territory like a crown jewel, a massive stone structure that had stood for 3 centuries, its walls carved with the names of every Alpha who'd ever ruled, its halls echoing with the footsteps of wolves who mattered. Kyle had only been inside twice. Once as a child, when his father, a lowly tracker, had been summoned to report on border patrols. Once as a teenager, when he'd been brought before the Alpha Council to receive his official Omega designation. He remembered the second time clearly. The council had sat in a semicircle on raised platforms, their faces stern and judgmental, their eyes cold as they looked down at the scrawny 16-year-old boy who'd failed every dominance test, who'd submitted to every challenge, who'd shown absolutely no signs of the strength required to be anything more than what he was born to be. Omega, the head counselor had declared, and the word had fallen on Kale's shoulders like a chain. Now, at 23, Kale lived in the outer quarters, a cluster of small stone buildings where the Omegas, the servants, and the pack's laborers made their homes. It wasn't terrible. He had his own room, tiny as it was. He had his work at the forge, which he actually enjoyed when people like Dimitri weren't making his life miserable. He had enough food, enough safety, enough of the bare minimum to survive. But he didn't have freedom. He didn't have choice. He didn't have the right to look an Alpha in the eye without permission, or speak at pack gatherings unless spoken to, or dream of anything beyond the narrow confines of his predetermined fate. "You're brooding again." Kyle looked up from the stew he'd been absently stirring to find Lena sliding onto the bench across from him. She was one of the few people in the pack who treated him like an actual person. A fellow Omega who worked in the pack house kitchens with warm brown skin, clever dark eyes, and a smile that could disarm even the cruelest wolves. "I'm not brooding," Kale muttered. "I'm thinking." "Same thing with you." Lena stole a piece of bread from his plate and tore off a chunk. "Let me guess. Dimitri was an ass again? When isn't he?" "Fair point." She chewed thoughtfully, her eyes scanning the common hall around them. It was late evening, and the space was half full, with other lower-ranked wolves finishing their dinners, their conversations creating a low hum of background noise. "You know what you need? A different life? Besides that," Lena leaned forward conspiratorially, "you need to come to the Blood Moon Festival next week. Stop hiding in your forge and actually live for once." Kale raised an eyebrow. The Blood Moon Festival was the pack's biggest celebration. 3 days of feasting, fighting exhibitions, and formal ceremonies where wolves could challenge for higher ranks or pledge loyalty to powerful families. It was also 3 days of Kyle being reminded exactly where he stood in the pack hierarchy. "Hard pass," he said. "Oh, come on. There's going to be music, dancing. I heard Rhaegar himself might make an appearance at the Commoners' Feast on the second night." Something tightened in Kale's chest at the name. He kept his expression carefully neutral. Why would I want to see Rhaegar Silverclaw? Lena grinned. Because he's gorgeous? Because he's powerful? Because every unmated wolf in the pack is going to be throwing themselves at him, and it'll be the most entertaining disaster you've ever witnessed? Kael shook his head, but he couldn't help the tiny smile that tugged at his lips. You're ridiculous. And you're too serious. Lena's expression softened slightly. I worry about you, Kael. You spend all your time alone. You don't let anyone in. You're like a ghost haunting the edge of the pack. Maybe I like being a ghost. Nobody likes being a ghost. Before Kael could respond, a commotion erupted near the entrance to the common hall. Voices rose in alarm. Chairs scraped against stone. Kael and Lena both turned to see what was happening. A guard, one of the Alpha's personal sentries, stood in the doorway, his face grim, his hand resting on the sword at his hip. "Kael Brennan," the guard called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall. "You're summoned to the pack house, immediately." Every eye in the room turned to Kael. His heart began to pound. "What for?" he asked, his voice steady, despite the fear creeping up his spine. The guard's expression didn't change. "That's not information you're entitled to, Omega. Move, now." Kael stood slowly, his mind racing. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd kept his head down, finished his work, stayed out of trouble. There was no reason for the Alpha's guards to summon him unless someone wanted him gone. Lena grabbed his hand as he passed, her grip tight and urgent. "Be careful," she whispered. Kael nodded once, then followed the guard out into the night, his wolf whispering warnings he couldn't quite hear, his instincts screaming that something was very, very wrong. He had no idea that in 2 days he would stand before the entire pack court. He had no idea that in 2 days an Alpha would try to force him to his knees. He had no idea that in 2 days he would speak 3 words that would change everything. "I bow to no Alpha." Chapter 2. The Accusation. The pack house at night was a different beast entirely. During the day, it bustled with activity. Servants rushing through corridors, guards stationed at every corner, high-ranking wolves conducting business in opulent rooms filled with ancient artifacts and expensive furniture. But at night, when the moon hung heavy in the sky and most of the pack slept, the pack house became something else. Something older, something that remembered the blood spilled in its halls, the betrayals whispered in its shadows, the bodies buried beneath its foundations. Kael felt all of this as the guard led him through corridors he'd never walked before. His footsteps echoed against marble floors, torchlight flickered across tapestries depicting legendary battles and fallen heroes. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything except keep walking toward whatever fate awaited him. But Omegas didn't run from summons. Omegas obeyed. Even when obedience felt like walking toward the executioner's blade, they climbed a spiral staircase, up, 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 toward the private quarters where only the Alpha's family and their most trusted advisors were permitted. Kael's pulse quickened with every step. Why would they bring him here? What possible reason could there be for an Omega forge worker to be summoned to the heart of the pack's power? Finally, they stopped before a heavy oak door. 2 more guards stood sentinel on either side, their faces carved from stone, their hands resting on their weapons. The guard who'd escorted Kael knocked twice. "Enter," came a voice from within. Cold, authority incarnate. The door swung open. The room beyond was some kind of study or war room. Maps covered one wall, marked with territories and borders and patrol routes. Weapons hung on another, swords and axes and spears that looked ancient and deadly. A massive desk dominated the center of the space, and behind it sat a man who made every other wolf Kael had ever met look like children playing dress-up. Alpha Caster Silverclaw. He was in his 50s but looked ageless. Silver hair pulled back from a face that could have been carved from granite, eyes the color of winter ice, a body that still radiated the kind of power that could crush lesser wolves without effort. He wore simple dark clothing, but somehow that made him seem even more dangerous. He didn't need decoration. His presence was decoration enough. and standing beside him, arms crossed and expression unreadable, was Rhaegar Silverclaw. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen Rhaegar from a distance, yes, but up close, the Alpha's son was overwhelming. Tall, easily 6.5 feet, with black hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes the color of molten gold. His face was all sharp angles and predatory beauty, the kind of face that made you think of ancient gods and modern nightmares. He wore fighting leathers that clung to a body built for violence, and even standing still, he radiated the kind of dominance that made Kyle wolf want to simultaneously submit and challenge him. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was wrong in every possible way. "Kyle Brennan," Alpha Caster said, his voice cutting through Kyle's spiraling thoughts like a knife. "Do you know why you're here?" Kyle forced himself to focus, to breathe, to remember that showing fear in front of Alphas was blood in the water. "No, Alpha, I don't." "No?" Caster's eyebrow rose slightly. "You have no idea? No inkling whatsoever?" "I've done nothing wrong." Kale kept his voice steady, his eyes respectfully lowered. Not submission, just the bare minimum of protocol required to survive this conversation. "I work in the forge. I keep to myself. I follow pack law." "Interesting." Caster leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling beneath his chin. "Then perhaps you can explain why your scent was found in my private chambers this afternoon, in the room where my brother, Beta Aldrich Silverclaw, was discovered dead with a knife in his back." The world tilted sideways. Kale's mind went blank, then flooded with 1,000 thoughts at once. Dead. Murder. His scent. Impossible. Impossible. He'd never been in the Alpha's private chambers. He'd never even been on this floor of the pack house before tonight. He'd never touched Beta Aldrich, never spoken to him, never had any reason to. "That's not possible," Kale breathed. I've never— "Your scent doesn't lie." This came from Rhaegar, his voice low and dark and infinitely more dangerous than his father's. He pushed off from where he'd been leaning against the wall and took a step closer to Kyle. "The trackers confirmed it. You were in that room." "I wasn't!" The words burst out of Kale before he could stop them. His wolf surged forward, not in aggression, but in desperate self-preservation. "I've been in the forge all day. Lena Cortez from the kitchens. She brought me lunch. Dmitry Volkov came by to complain about his armor. There are witnesses." "I didn't—" "Witnesses can be bought," Caster interrupted coldly. "Witnesses can be threatened. Witnesses can lie." "But I'm not lying." Kale's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His heart hammered against his ribs. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. Why would I kill Beta Aldrich? I've never even met him. What possible motive would I have? "That," Rhaegar said quietly, his golden eyes fixed on Kyle with an intensity that made Kyle's skin prickle, "is what we intend to find out." Caster stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. When he rose to his full height, the room seemed to shrink around him. "You will be held in the detention cells until the Grand Court convenes in 2 days. At that time, you will stand trial before the assembled pack. If you're found guilty, I'm innocent. You will be executed for the murder of a beta-ranked pack member and member of the Alpha's bloodline." Caster's expression didn't change, didn't soften, didn't show even a flicker of doubt or mercy. "If you're found innocent, you'll be released with the pack's apologies. But I should warn you, Kale Brennan, the evidence against you is substantial, and the court does not take kindly to Omegas who forget their place and reach for power through violence." The words hit Kale like physical blows. Execution, trial, evidence. None of it made sense. None of it was real. This had to be some kind of nightmare, some kind of fever dream brought on by stress and exhaustion and— "Take him to the cells," Caster commanded. Hands grabbed Kale's arms before he could react. The guards who'd been standing by the door moved with brutal efficiency, wrenching his arms behind his back and slapping cold iron manacles around his wrists. The metal burned against his skin, silver-laced, designed to suppress a wolf's abilities and keep them weak. "Wait!" Kyle struggled instinctively, his wolf snarling and clawing for freedom. "You can't! I didn't do this! Someone's setting me up! Someone's framing me!" "Everyone says that," Rhaegar said softly, and something in his tone made Kale's blood run cold. Not cruelty exactly, just certainty, as if he'd already decided Kale's guilt and was simply going through the motions of justice. "Take him away." They dragged Kale toward the door. He fought, not violently, not with the intent to escape, but with the desperate thrashing of a wolf who knew the trap was closing and couldn't do anything to stop it. "I'm innocent," he shouted as they hauled him into the corridor. "I'm innocent!" His voice echoed off the stone walls, but no one answered. No one came to his defense. No one stopped the guards as they dragged him down staircases and through forgotten passages to the bowels of the pack house, where the detention cells waited like open mouths, ready to swallow him whole. The cell was exactly as miserable as Kyle had imagined. 10 feet by 10 feet, stone walls covered in ancient moss and newer bloodstains. A thin pallet in one corner that looked like it had been used by 100 prisoners before him. A bucket in the opposite corner that served as a toilet. No windows. No light except for the torch burning in the corridor outside the iron bars. They'd thrown him inside without ceremony, locked the door with a heavy clang, and left him there in the darkness, with only his racing thoughts for company. Kyle collapsed onto the pallet, his manacled hands pressed against his face, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Someone was framing him. Someone had killed Beta Aldrich and deliberately left Kyle's scent at the scene. But who? And why? What could anyone possibly gain from pinning a murder on a nobody Omega Forge worker? Unless that was exactly the point. Kale's mind worked frantically through the possibilities. If you wanted to kill someone important and get away with it, you needed a scapegoat, someone disposable, someone no one would defend. Someone whose death after conviction would barely register as a footnote in pack history, someone like an Omega. But how had they gotten his scent into the Alpha's chambers? Had they stolen something from his room, from the forge? Had they followed him and collected trace evidence? The pack's trackers were skilled, but they weren't infallible. If someone had planted evidence carefully enough— "Thinking hard, Omega?" Kale's head snapped up. A figure stood in the shadows just outside his cell, barely visible in the torchlight. For a moment, Kale's exhausted mind couldn't process what he was seeing. Then the figure stepped closer, and Kale's breath stopped. Rhaegar Silverclaw stood on the other side of the bars, his golden eyes gleaming in the darkness, his expression unreadable. "What do you want?" Kale asked hoarsely. His wolf stirred uneasily, confused by the Alpha heir's presence, uncertain whether to submit or prepare for an attack. Rhaegar didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Kale with the kind of intensity that made Kale feel like he was being dissected and examined and catalogued for future reference. "I want," Rhaegar said finally, his voice soft and deadly, "to understand why you're lying. I'm not— Your scent was in that room. Multiple trackers confirmed it independently. There's no conspiracy, no grand plot, just facts. And facts don't lie." Kale pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the way his legs trembled with exhaustion and fear. He moved to the bars, gripping them with his manacled hands, and forced himself to meet Rhaegar's eyes directly. Protocol be damned. "Then your facts are wrong," he said quietly. "Or someone manipulated them. Because I did not kill Beta Aldrich. I have no reason to kill him, no means to get into those chambers, and no desire to die for a crime I didn't commit." Something flickered in Rhaegar's expression. Surprise, maybe, or respect, or just curiosity at an Omega who dared to look an Alpha heir in the eye and contradict him. "You're either very brave or very stupid," Rhaegar murmured. "I'm desperate," Kale shot back. "And desperate wolves don't have the luxury of fear." For a long moment, they stood there on opposite sides of the bars, locked in a silent battle of wills that neither seemed willing to break. Then Rhaegar did something unexpected. He smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It wasn't friendly. But it was genuine, the smile of someone who'd just encountered something interesting in a world that had grown too predictable. "We'll see," Rhaegar said softly. "In 2 days, you'll stand before the Grand Court, before the assembled pack, before me. And if you're truly innocent, Chael Brennan, then I suppose we'll discover who's actually responsible for my uncle's death." He turned to leave. "And if I'm not found innocent?" Chael called after him. "If your court decides an Omega is guilty just because it's easier than finding the truth?" Rhaegar paused at the edge of the torchlight. When he looked back, his golden eyes glowed like embers in the darkness. "Then you'll die," he said simply, "and the pack will move on. Because that's what packs do, Omega. We survive, we endure, and we sacrifice the weak so the strong can thrive." He disappeared into the shadows, his footsteps fading down the corridor until Kyle was alone again with nothing but stone walls and growing dread and the terrible certainty that in 2 days he would either prove his innocence or die trying. And in the darkness of his cell, Kyle began to plan. Because if the pack wouldn't give him justice, then he'd have to take it for himself. Chapter 3. The Grand Court. 2 days in a cell changed a wolf. Not physically, though Chael's body ached from sleeping on stone, and his wrists bore raw marks from the silver manacles, and his stomach cramped from the meager portions of stale bread and water they'd given him. But mentally, spiritually, in all the ways that mattered, Chael had been transformed. He'd spent 48 hours replaying every moment of the day Beta Aldrich died, every person he'd seen, every conversation he'd had, every second accounted for, and he'd come to one inescapable conclusion. Whoever had framed him had access to his belongings, knowledge of his schedule, and enough skill to fool the pack's best trackers. That narrowed the suspects considerably. It also meant Chael was dealing with someone dangerous, someone connected, someone who wouldn't hesitate to watch him die for a crime they'd committed. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it ignited something dark and fierce in his chest, something that burned hotter than fear, sharper than desperation. Rage. Pure, crystalline rage at the injustice of it all. At being born Omega. At being invisible his entire life until someone needed a scapegoat. At living in a world where alphas like Rhaegar Silverclaw could look him in the eye and tell him he'd be sacrificed so the strong could survive. Chael had been afraid his whole life. He'd been small and quiet and obedient, playing the part they'd assigned him, staying in his lane, accepting his fate. But sitting in that cell with death waiting 2 days away, Chael made a decision. If he was going to die, he'd die standing. He'd die fighting. He'd die making them see him, really see him, for the first time in his miserable, invisible life. And if he was very lucky, he'd die taking the real killer down with him. The morning of the trial arrived with gray skies and the smell of rain. The guards came for him just after dawn. They hauled him out of his cell without a word, dragged him through corridors he barely registered, and deposited him in a small antechamber just off the Grand Court. Through the thick stone walls, Chael could hear voices, hundreds of them. The entire pack had assembled to witness his trial, to see the Omega who dared to kill a Beta, to watch justice be served, to celebrate or mourn depending on which side of the hierarchy they stood on. Chael's hands shook. He clenched them into fists, willing the trembling to stop. The silver manacles still bound his wrists. But they'd at least allowed him to wash and given him clean clothes, simple gray trousers and a tunic that marked him as a prisoner, but didn't leave him standing before the court covered in filth. Small mercies. Cruel mercies. Nervous, Omega? Chael turned to find Dmitri Volkov leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed, a smirk playing at his lips. He looked immaculate as always, golden hair perfectly styled, expensive clothing tailored to show off his warrior's build, every inch the privileged Beta who'd never known a day of real hardship in his life. "Why are you here?" Chael asked flatly. "I'm testifying." Dimitri's smirk widened. "About your volatile temperament, your tendency toward anger, The way you looked at me when I came to the forge that day, like you wanted to kill me." Ice flooded Kale's veins. "You're lying." "Am I?" Dmitri pushed off from the doorframe and sauntered closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Or am I just helping the court see the truth? That you're not the meek little Omega you pretend to be. That you're dangerous, unstable, exactly the kind of wolf who'd snap and plunge a knife into someone's back." Kale's wolf snarled, pushing against the silver's suppression, his vision hazed red at the edges. "You son of a—" "Careful." Dmitri's smile turned predatory. "Threatening a witness won't help your case, but please, by all means, prove my point about your temper." Before Kale could respond, before he could do something stupid like lunge at Dmitri and make everything infinitely worse, the door to the grand court swung open. A guard appeared. "It's time." Dmitri straightened, his smirk never faltering. "See you in there, Omega. Try not to embarrass yourself." He strode past Kale and into the court, leaving Kale standing there with rage and helplessness warring in his chest. The guard gripped Kale's arm. "Move." Kale took a breath, then another. He forced the red haze from his vision, forced his wolf back into its cage, forced himself to remember the plan. "Stand tall, speak truth, make them see you." He stepped through the doorway and into the grand court. The grand court was exactly as magnificent and terrifying as Kale had imagined. The chamber was massive, a circular space with soaring ceilings, supported by ancient stone pillars carved with wolf imagery. Tiered seating rose on all sides, packed with wolves from every rank and station. Alphas in the front rows, their power radiating like heat. Betas behind them, dressed in finery and watching with hungry eyes. Omegas in lower ranks in the back, their faces ranging from sympathetic to gleeful, depending on how they felt about watching one of their own go down. At the far end of the chamber, on a raised platform, sat the judging council. 7 wolves, all high-ranking, all ancient, all wearing the traditional black robes that marked them as arbiters of pack law. And in the center of the platform, in a throne carved from a single massive piece of obsidian, sat Alpha Caster Silverclaw. To his right stood Rhaegar. The Alpha heir wore full ceremonial armor, black metal etched with silver wolf designs, a crimson cloak fastened at his shoulders, his dark hair pulled back to reveal the sharp beauty of his face. He looked like a war god. He looked like death incarnate. And when his golden eyes locked onto Kale, as the guards led him to the center of the chamber, Kale felt the weight of that gaze, like a physical thing pressing against his chest. The guards positioned Kale in the accused circle, a raised stone platform in the center of the chamber, visible from all sides, designed to make the accused feel small and exposed and utterly alone. Kale lifted his chin and stared straight ahead. Alpha Caster rose from his throne. The chamber fell silent instantly. "We are gathered here to render judgment on Kale Brennan, Omega-ranked member of the Moonshadow Pack, accused of the murder of Beta Aldrich Silverclaw." His voice carried to every corner of the massive space, cold and absolute. "The accused will hear the evidence against him. He will be given the opportunity to speak in his own defense. And then this council will determine his guilt or innocence, according to pack law." Caster's eyes swept across the assembled wolves, and Kale saw calculation in that gaze. This wasn't just a trial. This was theater, a demonstration of power and order, a reminder that the pack's hierarchy was sacred and inviolable. "Bring forth the first witness," Caster commanded. A tracker stepped forward, one of the pack's most respected, a grizzled alpha named Torsten who'd been tracking for 40 years. He approached the platform and bowed to the council. "State your findings," Caster ordered. Torsten's voice was rough but clear. "I was called to the Alpha's private chambers the evening of Beta Aldrich's death. The body was still warm. The scent trail was fresh. I detected 2 distinct scents in the room. The victims and the accuseds." Murmurs rippled through the court. Kale's jaw clenched. "You're certain it was the accused's scent?" one of the council members asked. Absolutely certain. I've tracked wolves for 4 decades. I know the difference between contamination and presence. Cale Brennan was in that room within hours of the murder. More murmurs, louder now. Kyle could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, judgment already forming in minds that had decided his guilt before the trial even began. "Second witness," Castor called. Dimitri stepped forward, and Kyle's hands clenched into fists. Dimitri bowed with perfect, mocking courtesy. "I can speak to the accused's temperament, Alpha. 3 days before the murder, I visited his forge to inquire about my armor. He was hostile, aggressive. When I pressed him about the timeline, he became physically threatening, tensing as if to attack, his eyes showing clear signs of his wolf's dominance." Lies, all lies. But delivered with such smooth confidence that Kyle could see some of the assembled wolves nodding, accepting Dimitri's version of events as truth. "Did he actually attack you?" a council member asked. "No," Dimitri admitted, "but only because I'm beta ranked, and he knew better. The intent was clear, though. The rage was there." "Thank you." Castor gestured for Dimitri to step back. Third witness. A servant came forward, a middle-aged woman Cale vaguely recognized from the pack house. She testified that she'd seen Kyle near the private quarters the day of the murder, loitering in a corridor where Omegas had no business being. Cale's mind raced. He'd never been in that corridor. The woman was lying or mistaken or she'd been paid to lie, threatened to lie, convinced that testifying against an Omega was safer than staying silent. One by one, the witnesses came forward, each one adding another brick to the wall of evidence surrounding Kyle, each one making his innocence seem more implausible, more desperate, more like the futile denials of a guilty wolf with nothing left to lose. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Alpha Castor raised his hand for silence. The accused will now have the opportunity to speak in his own defense. His cold eyes fixed on Kyle. "Kyle Brennan, what do you say to these charges?" Every wolf in the chamber leaned forward slightly. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Kyle looked around the court, at the alphas watching with detached interest, at the betas hungry for blood, at the omegas in the back who wouldn't meet his eyes because they were too afraid to show solidarity with the condemned wolf. Then he looked at Rhaegar. The alpha heir stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable, his golden eyes fixed on Kale with that same intense focus he'd shown in the cell 2 nights ago. And in that moment, Kale made his choice. He wouldn't beg, he wouldn't plead, he wouldn't play the part of the meek, submissive Omega desperate for mercy from wolves who'd already decided he was disposable. Instead, he'd give them the truth. Raw and unfiltered and undeniable. "I didn't kill Beta Aldrich," Kale said, his voice ringing clear across the silent chamber. "I've never been in the Alpha's private chambers. I had no motive, no means, and no opportunity to commit this murder. Someone framed me. Someone planted evidence. Someone decided that an Omega's life was worth sacrificing to protect themselves." "A convenient excuse," one of the council members said dryly. "It's the truth." Kale took a step forward, his manacles clinking. "And if this court cared about truth instead of convenience, you'd be investigating who actually killed Beta Aldrich instead of railroading the easiest target." Gasps erupted throughout the chamber. You didn't speak to the council like that. You didn't question their judgment, especially not as an accused Omega on trial for your life. But Kyle was done playing by rules that were designed to keep him powerless. Alpha Castor's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You dare!" "I dare to tell the truth," Kale interrupted, and even he was shocked by the steadiness in his voice, "because I have nothing left to lose. You've already decided I'm guilty. You've already decided an Omega couldn't possibly be innocent when the evidence is so convenient. So yes, Alpha, I dare." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Rhaegar moved. He stepped forward from his position beside his father's throne, his armor gleaming in the torchlight, his presence commanding every eye in the chamber. "You claim innocence," Rhaegar said, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the court. You claim you were framed. Very well. Prove it. Chael's breath caught. What? Rhaegar's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. If you're innocent, you should be able to tell us who the real killer is. You should have evidence, suspects, something more than desperate denial. It was a trap. Chael knew it was a trap. But it was also the only opening he was going to get. Give me 3 days, Chael said. 3 days to investigate. 3 days to find the real killer. If I can't provide proof of my innocence by then, I'll accept whatever punishment you deem fit. The council members exchanged glances. Murmurs rippled through the assembled pack. Alpha Caster's expression remained cold and skeptical. This is highly irregular, one council member protested. So is condemning an innocent wolf, Chael shot back. Rhaegar turned to his father. For a long moment, the two alphas engaged in some kind of silent communication that Chael couldn't decipher. Then Caster spoke. Very well. The accused will have 3 days to provide evidence of his innocence. He will remain under constant guard. He will have limited access to pack resources. And if he fails to produce credible proof, Caster's eyes bored into Chael like spears of ice, he will be executed at dawn on the 4th day. No appeals, no mercy. Do you accept these terms? 3 days. 72 hours to find a killer who'd successfully framed him and fooled the pack's best trackers. It was impossible. It was suicide. It was the only chance he had. I accept, Chael said. Then this court is adjourned until the accused's deadline. Caster rose from his throne. May the moon guide your investigation, Chael Brennan, because nothing else will save you. The guards moved to escort Chael from the chamber, but as they grabbed his arms, Chael locked eyes with Rhaegar one last time. The alpha heir was watching him with an expression Chael couldn't quite read. Interest? Respect? Or just the curiosity of a predator watching prey struggle before the inevitable end? 3 days, Rhaegar said quietly, his voice somehow cutting through the noise of the dispersing crowd. Don't waste them. Then Chael was being pulled away, dragged back through the doorway and into the antechamber, his mind already racing with plans and possibilities and the terrible knowledge that he had 72 hours to catch a killer, or die trying. Chapter 4. The investigation begins. They didn't take Chael back to the detention cells. Instead, the guards led him to a small room in the administrative wing of the pack house, barely larger than his cell, but with a real bed, a desk, a chair, and a narrow window that let in actual sunlight. A significant upgrade, though the two guards stationed outside his door made it clear this was still a prison, just a slightly more comfortable one. Chael paced the small space, his mind churning through everything he knew and everything he didn't. 3 days, 72 hours. Where did he even begin? A knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Enter!" he called, expecting another guard or perhaps a council member coming to outline the restrictions of his investigation. Instead, Lena slipped through the doorway, carrying a tray of food. Relief and guilt crashed over Chael in equal measure. "Lena? Don't." She set the tray down on the desk with more force than necessary, her dark eyes blazing. "Don't you dare apologize or try to send me away, or any of that noble self-sacrificing nonsense. I'm helping you whether you like it or not." Despite everything, the trial, the death sentence hanging over his head, the impossible task before him, Chael felt a small smile tug at his lips. "They're letting you help me? They're letting me bring you meals." Lena's expression softened slightly. "What I do beyond that is my business. Now sit down and eat. You look like death, and you can't solve a murder on an empty stomach." Chael sat. The food was simple but substantial. Fresh bread, roasted meat, vegetables that actually had flavor. Omega rations, but generous ones. Someone had decided he deserved decent meals for his last few days alive. How thoughtful. "What are people saying?" Chael asked between bites. "In the pack, about the trial." Lena settled into the chair across from him, her fingers drumming against the desk. Mixed reactions. Most of the high ranks think you're guilty, and the 3-day thing is just Alpha Caster being merciful, giving you time to make peace with the moon or whatever. The Omegas... She hesitated. Some believe you, some don't. Some are just scared to be associated with you in case you really are a murderer. Kyle nodded slowly. He'd expected nothing less. And Dimitri? The other witnesses? Dimitri's been telling anyone who'll listen about how dangerous and unstable you are, painting himself as the brave beta who narrowly avoided being your first victim. Lena's lip curled in disgust. The servant who claimed she saw you near the private quarters? Her name is Marta. She's been with the pack house for 15 years, never caused trouble, never lied that anyone knows of. So either she's telling the truth, or someone scared her enough to make her lie. Lena leaned forward. Kale, if you're being framed, whoever's doing it has power, resources, the ability to manipulate evidence and intimidate witnesses. That's not just any random wolf. That's someone connected. Kale had reached the same conclusion in his cell, which means I need to figure out who benefits from Beta Aldrich's death, and who benefits from you taking the fall for it. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the task ahead settling over them like a shroud. Finally, Kyle spoke. I need to see the body, or at least the crime scene. I need to know exactly how he died, where he died, what the actual physical evidence looks like. That's going to be difficult. The private chambers are restricted, and you're not exactly a welcome guest up there. Then I'll need help. Kale met Lena's eyes. From someone with access. Someone who can get me information the council doesn't want me to have. Like who? Most of the pack won't risk helping you. Anyone seen aiding an accused murderer could face punishment themselves. Kale's mind raced through possibilities. He needed someone with enough rank to access restricted areas, but enough independence to risk helping him. Someone who had a reason to want the truth uncovered. Someone who... The door opened again without warning. Both Kale and Lena jumped to their feet as Rhaegar Silverclaw stepped into the room. The Alpha heir had changed out of his ceremonial armor and now wore simple black clothing that somehow made him look even more dangerous. His golden eyes swept across the small space, taking in Lena's presence, the food tray, the way Kyle had instinctively positioned himself between Rhaegar and his friend. "Leave us," Rhaegar said to Lena. "I'm not leaving him alone with—" Lena started, her voice defiant despite the way her hands trembled slightly. It wasn't a request. Rhaegar's tone didn't rise, didn't harden, but the command in it was absolute. "I need to speak with the accused privately. You can wait outside with the guards." Lena looked at Kyle, a question in her eyes. "Do you want me to stay? Should I fight this?" Kyle gave her a small nod. "It's okay. I'll be fine." She didn't look convinced, but she knew better than to argue with the Alpha heir. With one last worried glance, she slipped past Rhaegar and out the door. The moment it clicked shut, the air in the room changed. Rhaegar took a step closer, then another. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his presence filling the small space until Kyle felt like the walls were closing in. His scent, cedar and smoke, and something wild and ancient, washed over Kyle, making his wolf stir uneasily. "You surprised me today," Rhaegar said quietly. "In the court." Kale forced himself to stand his ground. "How so?" "Most Omegas in your position would have begged, pleaded, thrown themselves on the council's mercy, and hoped for leniency." Rhaegar's head tilted slightly, his golden eyes studying Kale with unnerving intensity. "But you didn't. You challenged us, accused us of caring more about convenience than justice. That takes either incredible courage or incredible stupidity." "Maybe both," Kale said flatly. "Or maybe I just realized that begging doesn't work when people have already decided you're guilty." A ghost of a smile touched Rhaegar's lips. "True. The court had made its decision before you ever walked through those doors. Your guilt was a foregone conclusion." The casual admission hit Kale like a punch to the gut. "Then why give me 3 days? Why pretend I have a chance when you've all already decided? Because I want to know the truth. The words hung in the air between them. Kale stared at Rhaegar, trying to find the deception, the manipulation, the angle. But Rhaegar's expression remained serious, his eyes holding something that looked almost like sincerity. You want the truth, Kale repeated slowly. You. The alpha heir who told me 2 nights ago that I'd be sacrificed so the strong could survive. I did say that. Rhaegar moved to the window, his back to Kale, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the gray afternoon light. And I meant it. The pack's survival comes before any individual wolf. That's the first law of our kind. But he trailed off, and Kale found himself taking an involuntary step closer. But what? Rhaegar turned back to face him. But I also believe in justice. Real justice. Not the theatrical version my father performs for the pack's benefit. And something about your case doesn't sit right with me. Kale's heart hammered against his ribs. What do you mean? The evidence is too perfect, too convenient. Rhaegar crossed his arms, his expression thoughtful. My uncle was killed in his private chambers, a place with multiple security measures, guards posted at every entrance, magical wards that alert us to unauthorized presence. Yet somehow, you, an Omega with no combat training, no access codes, no way past those defenses, managed to sneak in, kill a trained beta warrior, and leave behind nothing but your scent? I've been saying that since... I know what you've been saying. Rhaegar's voice sharpened slightly. And I know what the evidence says. What I don't know is which one is actually true. So I convinced my father to give you 3 days because I want to see what you find. I want to see if you're a clever murderer, spinning desperate lies, or an innocent wolf who's been expertly framed. Kale's mind reeled. The alpha heir, the most powerful wolf in the pack aside from his father, believed there might be reasonable doubt in his case. It wasn't an admission of innocence, but it was more than Kale had dared hope for. If I'm being framed, Kale said carefully, then whoever did it has access to places I don't, information I don't, the ability to manipulate evidence and witnesses. I can't investigate this alone. I need help. Rhaegar nodded slowly. Which is why I'm here. Kale's breath caught. You're going to help me? I'm going to give you access to what you need. The crime scene, the evidence reports, my uncle's private files and correspondence, everything the council used to build their case against you. Rhaegar's golden eyes bored into Kale's. But understand this, if I find even a hint that you actually committed this murder, if I discover you're using this investigation to cover your tracks or destroy evidence, I will end you myself. No trial, no mercy, just swift justice. The threat hung in the air, deadly serious and utterly sincere. Kale met Rhaegar's gaze without flinching. I didn't kill your uncle, and when I prove that, you're going to owe me an apology. For a moment, Rhaegar's expression remained stony. Then, to Kale's absolute shock, the alpha heir laughed, a short, sharp sound that transformed his entire face. Bold words from a wolf in chains. But there was something almost appreciative in Rhaegar's tone. Very well, Kale Brennan. Let's see if your courage matches your conviction. Meet me in the East Archive in 1 hour. We'll start with the evidence reports and work our way backward. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. And Kyle, don't make me regret this. My father thinks I'm wasting time indulging your delusions. Prove him wrong. Then he was gone, leaving Kale standing in the middle of the small room with his heart racing and his mind spinning, and the first real spark of hope kindling in his chest. He had 3 days, 72 hours, and now he had help from the most unexpected source imaginable. The hunt for the real killer had officially begun. An hour later, Kyle stood in the East Archive with 2 guards flanking him and Rhaegar sorting through a stack of official reports on a reading table. The archive was a long, narrow room lined floor to ceiling with shelves holding documents, maps, ledgers, and historical records. The smell of old paper and leather bindings filled the air. A single window at the far end let in weak afternoon light that barely reached the shadowed corners. Riegar spread several documents across the table. These are the official tracker reports from the crime scene, Torsten's findings, plus 2 independent confirmations from other senior trackers. Cale leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the neat handwriting. Torsten's report was thorough and professional. Time of death estimated between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. Victim found at 5:47 p.m. by Alpha Castor during routine check. Single stab wound to the back between the shoulder blades. Blade penetrated the heart. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. 2 distinct scents detected. Victim's scent throughout the room. Accused's scent concentrated near the doorway and the body. Near the doorway and the body, Cale murmured. Not throughout the room like the victim's scent. Meaning? Riegar prompted. Meaning if I'd actually been in that room long enough to approach Beta Aldrich, kill him and leave, my scent should be more widespread. On the furniture, near the windows, by the weapons rack. Cale's finger traced the text. This pattern suggests either a very brief presence or scent transfer, Riegar finished. Someone carrying an object with your scent on it. Their eyes met across the table. It was the first piece of actual investigation, the first thread they could pull on. What objects of mine would carry enough scent to fool the trackers? Cale asked. Clothing, bedding, something you handle frequently. Riegar pulled out another document. According to the inventory of your quarters, nothing is missing. But that doesn't mean something wasn't borrowed and returned. Or stolen from the forge. I leave my work apron there overnight. My tools. Rags I use to wipe sweat. Cale's mind raced. Anyone with access to the forge could have taken something. Who has access? Officially, just me and the forge master. Unofficially, anyone who wants to walk in after hours. The door doesn't lock properly. I've been asking for repairs for months. Riegar made a note on a separate piece of parchment. We'll need to investigate the forge, see if anything seems disturbed or out of place. But first, he pulled out a final document, this one marked with the Alpha's personal seal. We need to talk about motive. Who wanted my uncle dead? Cale hesitated. This was dangerous territory. Speculating about who might want to murder a member of the Alpha's bloodline could itself be seen as treasonous. But Riegar was watching him with those intense golden eyes, waiting. And Cale realized that the Alpha heir was serious about this investigation. He wanted real answers, not comfortable lies. I don't know your uncle, Cale admitted. I didn't even know what he looked like until I saw his body in the reports. But someone in a position like his, beta rank, Alpha bloodline, access to power and resources, would have made enemies, political rivals, wolves who felt passed over for positions he held, maybe even personal grudges. All true. Riegar's expression darkened. My uncle was ambitious. He wanted a council seat. He'd been positioning himself for years and building alliances, making promises. Some of those promises conflicted with other power players' interests. Like who? That's what we need to find out. Riegar began gathering the documents. Tonight, we'll search his personal quarters, go through his correspondence, his private records, see if anyone stands out as a potential threat. Cale blinked. You're taking me to a restricted area? The council gave you 3 days to investigate. I'm simply facilitating that investigation. Riegar's lips curved into something that might have been a smile. Unless you'd prefer to do this alone. No, Cale caught himself. Thank you for believing me enough to help. I don't believe you, Riegar corrected. I believe there are unanswered questions. There's a difference. Fair enough. They spent the next 2 hours going through every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every detail of the crime scene. Cale's guards stood silently by the door, their expressions unreadable, but their postures tense. This wasn't normal. An accused murderer working closely with the Alpha heir, being given access to restricted information, being treated like an actual investigator instead of a condemned prisoner. But Rhaegar seemed unconcerned with propriety. He questioned everything, challenged every assumption, pushed Kyle to think like a detective instead of a victim. And slowly, a picture began to emerge. Beta Aldrich had been in his chambers alone that afternoon, unusual for him, as he typically kept guards or attendants nearby. He'd sent everyone away, claiming he needed privacy for important correspondence. Someone had come to his door during that window. Someone he'd let inside without calling for guards, someone he'd trusted, someone who'd stabbed him in the back while his guard was down. This wasn't a crime of passion, Kyle said, staring at the documents spread before them. This was planned, calculated. The killer knew Beta Aldrich's schedule, knew when he'd be alone, knew how to get past security. And knew they needed a scapegoat ready to take the fall, Rhaegar added grimly. Their eyes met again, and Kale saw understanding dawn in Rhaegar's expression. This wasn't just about murder. This was about power, politics, someone making a move in the pack's hierarchy and using Kyle as a disposable pawn in whatever game they were playing. "We need to find out who benefits from your uncle's death," Kale said. "Who moves up with him gone? Who gets access to power or position or resources they didn't have before?" Rhaegar's jaw clenched. "Several wolves, but we'll narrow it down tonight." He began rolling up the documents, preparing to secure them back in their proper places. But Kyle caught his arm, stopping him. The contact sent a jolt through Kyle's system. His wolf immediately recognized the Alpha's power, the danger, the absolute authority in that arm. But Kyle didn't let go. "Why are you really doing this?" Kyle asked quietly. "Why risk your reputation? You're standing with the council to help an Omega you barely know?" Rhaegar looked down at where Kale's hand gripped his arm. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he said, his voice low and fierce, "Because I've watched this pack sacrifice too many innocent wolves at the altar of convenience. Because my father taught me that power without justice is just tyranny with better clothes. And because when I looked in your eyes in that court, I didn't see a killer. I saw a wolf who deserved better than being thrown away like garbage." He pulled his arm free, not roughly, but firmly. "Now come on, we have a murder to solve and less than 3 days to do it." As they left the archive, Kale felt something shift inside him. The Alpha heir believed him. Not fully, not unconditionally, but enough to fight for the truth. It was more than he'd hoped for, more than he'd dared dream, and it meant that maybe, just maybe, he actually had a chance at survival. Chapter 5. Shadows and Secrets. Night fell over the pack house like a predator settling in for the kill. Kyle stood in his temporary quarters, watching the last light fade from the sky through his narrow window. Somewhere below, the pack went about its evening routines, dinners, patrols, social gatherings, all the normal rhythms of life that continued whether or not an Omega was about to be executed for a crime he didn't commit. The normalcy of it all felt surreal. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Before he could respond, Rhaegar stepped inside, dressed entirely in black, his golden eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "Time to go," the Alpha heir said quietly. "The corridors will be clearest in the next hour. After that, the night patrol rotation begins." Kale's guards had been dismissed for the evening. Or rather, Rhaegar had ordered them away with the kind of authority that didn't invite argument. Now it was just the two of them, about to break into a dead Beta's private chambers in search of evidence that might or might not exist. "If we're caught," Kale started, "we won't be." Rhaegar's confidence was absolute. "I know every guard rotation, every patrol route, every blind spot in this building. My father made sure I learned them as part of my training. He just didn't anticipate I'd use that knowledge to investigate a murder he thinks is already solved." They moved through the pack house like shadows, keeping to the darkened corridors and servants' passages that most high-ranking wolves never bothered to learn. Rhaegar led with certainty, his footsteps silent on the stone floors, his presence somehow both commanding and utterly stealthy. Kale followed close behind, his heart hammering, his senses hyper-alert. Every distant sound made his wolf twitch with anxiety. Every shadow could be a guard. Every corner could hide someone who'd report them to the council. But they encountered no one. Finally, they reached a section of the pack house Cale had only seen once, during his first summons 2 nights ago. The private quarters of the Alpha's family and their closest blood relations. Rhaegar stopped before a heavy wooden door marked with Beta Aldrich's family crest. A wolf in mid-leap over a crescent moon. Yellow rope had been strung across the entrance, marked with official seals declaring the area a restricted crime scene. "This is it," Rhaegar murmured. He produced a key from somewhere inside his dark clothing and unlocked the door with a soft click. "Stay close. Touch nothing unless I tell you to, and if anyone comes, follow my lead without question." Kyle nodded, not trusting his voice. They slipped inside. The chambers were impressive, a suite of rooms that included a sitting area, a bedroom, a private study, and what looked like a small armory. Expensive tapestries hung on the walls. Weapons from various territories were displayed on racks and pedestals. Books lined built-in shelves. Everything spoke of wealth, status, and refined taste. And in the center of the sitting room, a dark stain marked the expensive rug where Beta Aldrich had fallen. Cale stared at the stain, his stomach churning. A wolf had died here. Someone's brother, uncle, pack member. Whatever else Beta Aldrich had been, ambitious, political, complicated, he'd been a living being whose life had been violently stolen. And Cale had been blamed for that theft. "The body was found here," Rhaegar said, his voice quiet and professional. He'd shifted into investigator mode, his earlier intensity replaced by clinical focus. "Face down, single wound. The blade was still in his back when my father found him, a common hunting knife, the kind any wolf in the pack might own. It's been taken as evidence, but I saw it before the council secured it. Nothing distinctive, no engravings or unique markings." "So the killer used an untraceable weapon," Kyle murmured. "Smart. Very." Rhaegar moved to the doorway leading to the bedroom. "According to the tracker reports, your scent was concentrated near the entrance and around the body. But look at the room. What do you see?" Cale forced himself to look past the bloodstain and examine the space. Furniture in perfect order. Books neatly shelved, weapons properly displayed. No signs of struggle, no overturned chairs or scattered papers. Nothing out of place, except the dead body that had been removed hours ago. "There was no fight," Kyle said slowly. "Beta Aldrich was killed from behind, but if he'd been surprised by an intruder, especially an Omega intruder, he would have fought. He would have called for guards. There would be evidence of resistance." "Exactly." Rhaegar's golden eyes glinted with approval. "Which means he knew his killer. Trusted them enough to turn his back on them. Let them get close enough to strike a killing blow before he could react." Cale's mind raced through the implications. Someone he knew well. Someone he had no reason to fear. Someone whose presence in his chambers wouldn't raise alarms. "Someone from the pack's upper ranks," Rhaegar finished grimly. "An Omega like you would never have gotten this far without being stopped, questioned, or at minimum noticed. But a Beta or Alpha with legitimate business? They could walk these corridors freely." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of that realization settling over them. Whoever killed Beta Aldrich wasn't some desperate Omega. They were someone with power, position, and the intelligence to frame someone else for their crime. "The study," Cale said suddenly. "You mentioned going through his correspondence. If he was making political moves, building alliances, there might be—" "Already thinking like an investigator." Rhaegar moved toward the study door. "Come on. Let's see what secrets my uncle was keeping." The study was smaller than the sitting room, but no less impressive. A massive desk dominated the space, its surface clear, except for an ornate letter opener and an expensive fountain pen. Filing cabinets lined one wall. A locked chest sat in the corner, marked with magical wards that glowed faintly in the darkness. Rhaegar went straight for the desk, pulling open drawers with practiced efficiency. "I can access most of his files. The chest, though, that's warded against everyone except the Alpha and my uncle himself. We'll need to break the wards if we want to see what's inside." "Can you do that without alerting anyone?" "Possibly, but it'll take time we might not have." Rhaegar pulled out a stack of correspondence and spread it across the desk. "Start with these." Look for anything unusual, threats, conflicts, promises that might have created enemies. Kael moved to the desk and began sorting through the letters. Most were mundane, pack business, trade agreements, social invitations. But as he dug deeper, patterns began to emerge. Beta Aldrich had been corresponding with wolves from other territories. Lots of wolves. Alphas, betas, influential families from packs that bordered Moonshadow territory. And the tone of the letters was calculated, political. Each one carefully worded to promise something without committing to anything concrete. He was building a coalition, Kael said, his eyes scanning a particularly interesting letter from a beta in the neighboring Ironwood pack. Look at this. He's promising expanded trade routes and border agreements in exchange for support in some kind of council initiative. Rhaegar came to stand beside him, reading over his shoulder. The alpha air's scent washed over Kael, cedar and smoke and something that made Kael's wolf stir with conflicting impulses. Submit, challenge, flee, stay. He forced his attention back to the letter. That initiative was his bid for a council seat, Rhaegar said quietly. He'd been working toward it for 3 years. If he succeeded, he'd have significant influence over pack policy, authority second only to my father. Who else wanted that seat? 3 other candidates, all of them powerful, all of them with their own supporters. Rhaegar's jaw clenched. And all of them would benefit from my uncle's sudden removal from the competition. Kael's pulse quickened. Names. I need names. Rhaegar pulled out a piece of parchment and began writing. Helena Blackthorn, beta ranked, head of the pack's intelligence network, brilliant and ruthless. Victor Stormwind, alpha ranked, commands our eastern border guards, has a military background and loyal soldiers. And Dmitry Volkov's father, Ivan Volkov, beta ranked, controls most of the pack's trade operations, incredibly wealthy and well-connected. Kael's blood ran cold at the third name, Dmitry's father, the Golden Boy's patriarch, a wolf with enough resources and influence to manipulate evidence, intimidate witnesses, and frame a convenient omega for murder. And Dmitry himself had testified against Kael in the trial, had called him volatile, dangerous, threatening, had painted a picture of an omega on the edge of violence just waiting to snap. Had that been set up? Had Dmitry been building a narrative on his father's orders, creating a believable backstory for the scapegoat they'd chosen? Ivan Volkov, Kael said, his voice tight. He has the resources, the motive, and his son went out of his way to testify against me at the trial. What if... Don't jump to conclusions, Rhaegar warned, though his expression suggested he'd been thinking the same thing. Ivan is powerful enough that accusing him without ironclad evidence would be suicide. We need proof, something concrete that ties him to the murder. Then let's find it. Kael turned back to the letters, sorting through them with renewed urgency. There had to be something, some threat, some conflict, some piece of evidence that... His hand froze on a letter near the bottom of the stack. The handwriting was different from the others, rougher, less practiced. The paper was cheaper, and the message, though carefully worded, carried an unmistakable edge of menace. Your ambitions exceed your station, Aldrich. The council seat belongs to wolves with vision, not schemers playing at politics. Withdraw your bid, or you'll discover that some competitions have permanent consequences. Consider this your only warning. No signature, no seal, nothing to identify the sender, except... Kael lifted the paper to his nose and inhaled carefully. Beneath the smell of ink and paper there was something else. A scent, faint but distinctive, expensive cologne, imported tobacco, and underneath it all, the unmistakable musk of a beta wolf who spent considerable time in the pack's administrative offices. Rhaegar, Kael said quietly, I found something. The alpha heir crossed to him in 2 strides, taking the letter and reading it quickly. His expression darkened with each word. This is a direct threat, Rhaegar said. Sent to my uncle, maybe. 2 weeks before his death? Kael checked the date scrawled in the corner. 16 days. And the scent, I smell it. Rhaegar's eyes flashed gold. That's Ivan Volkov's scent. I'd recognize it anywhere. He smokes those imported silver-leaf cigars. No one else in the pack uses them." They stared at each other, the implications hanging heavy between them. Ivan Volkov had threatened Beta Aldrich, had warned him to withdraw from the council race or face permanent consequences. And 16 days later, Beta Aldrich was dead, and Ivan's political rival was conveniently eliminated. "This isn't enough," Kael said, even as hope flared in his chest. "A threatening letter doesn't prove he committed murder. He could claim it was just political posturing. Empty words meant to intimidate." "You're right." Ryagar folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his pocket. "But it's a start. And if Ivan sent one threat, there might be others. More evidence. Maybe even something that places him at the crime scene or connects him directly to the murder weapon. We need to search his office," Kael said, "his quarters. Anywhere he might have left traces of planning this. That's significantly more dangerous than being here." Ryagar's expression was grim. "Ivan Volkov isn't just influential. He's paranoid. His spaces are warded, guarded, monitored. Getting in without being detected would be nearly impossible. But not completely impossible." Ryagar's lips curved into something that was half smile, half snarl. "No, not completely." A sound in the corridor outside froze them both. Footsteps, voices. Someone was coming. Ryagar moved with inhuman speed, grabbing Kael's arm and pulling him toward the bedroom. "Hide! Now!" They barely made it through the doorway before the main entrance to the chambers opened. From their position pressed against the bedroom wall, just out of sight of the sitting room, Kael heard multiple sets of footsteps enter. 2 people, maybe 3, all heavy enough to be alpha or beta-ranked males. "Don't understand why we're bothering with this," a familiar voice said. "Dmitry Volkov. The Omega confessed his guilt by demanding an investigation. It's just desperate thrashing before the inevitable." "The Alpha heir seems to believe otherwise," another voice replied. Older, authoritative, with an edge of calculated patience. "Ryagar has been spending considerable time with the accused, giving him access to evidence, helping him investigate. It's concerning." Ivan Volkov. Kael would recognize that voice anywhere. He'd heard it often enough from a distance, delivering commands and making proclamations about pack business. "My son has always had a soft spot for lost causes," a third voice said, and Kael's blood turned to ice. Alpha Castor. The 3 wolves moved through the sitting room, their footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Kael and Ryagar remained perfectly still, pressed against the bedroom wall, barely breathing. "The question," Ivan continued, "is whether the boy's misguided sense of justice will lead him to conclusions that might prove problematic." "Problematic how?" Castor's tone was sharp. "The Omega's trial was meant to be simple, clean. Justice served, order restored, the pack moves forward. But if Ryagar finds evidence suggesting alternative theories, if he convinces others that the case isn't as straightforward as presented—" "He won't find anything," Castor interrupted coldly, "because there's nothing to find. The evidence is clear. The Omega's guilt is established. My son is wasting his time indulging in fantasies." Silence fell. Kael held his breath, his heart hammering so loud he was certain they'd hear it. Beside him, Ryagar's body was tense as a drawn bowstring, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. "Still," Ivan said carefully, "perhaps we should take precautions, ensure that certain sensitive materials remain secure, just in case the investigation takes any unexpected turns." "You worry too much, Ivan." Dimitri's voice dripped with confidence. "Even if the Omega and Ryagar stumble onto something inconvenient, who would believe it? The word of a condemned criminal and an alpha playing detective? The council will execute the Omega in 2 days, and everything will return to normal." "Perhaps you're right," Ivan said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. More footsteps. The sound of the main door opening. "Come. We have other matters to attend to." Castor's voice was final, dismissive. "Let the dead keep their secrets, and the living get on with survival." The door closed. The footsteps faded down the corridor. Kale and Rhaegar remained frozen for another full minute, making absolutely certain the wolves were truly gone. Finally, Rhaegar released a slow breath. "Did you hear that?" "Every word," Kale whispered. His mind was racing, trying to parse the implications of the conversation they'd just overheard. Ivan talked about sensitive materials and taking precautions. That's not the language of an innocent wolf. That's guilt, Rhaegar finished. His golden eyes blazed in the darkness. Or at minimum, knowledge of something that could implicate him. And my father... His jaw clenched. My father knows something, or suspects something. And he's choosing to let this proceed anyway. The betrayal in Rhaegar's voice was subtle, but unmistakable. The alpha heir had believed in his father's commitment to justice, had thought Castor would want the truth uncovered regardless of political convenience, but the conversation they'd overheard suggested otherwise. "We need to move faster," Kale said urgently. "If Ivan's going to secure his sensitive materials, we need to get to them before he can destroy evidence." Agreed. Rhaegar moved toward the bedroom window, checking the courtyard below. "Tomorrow night, we search Ivan's office. It's risky, but we don't have a choice. And if we're caught?" Rhaegar turned to face him, his expression fierce and determined. "Then we make sure whatever we find is worth the risk. Because if Ivan Volkov killed my uncle and framed you for it, I don't care how powerful he is. I don't care what political consequences come from exposing him. Justice matters more than convenience." The conviction in his voice sent a shiver down Kale's spine. This wasn't just about proving Kale's innocence anymore. This was about something deeper, about the kind of pack Rhaegar wanted to lead someday, about the principles he'd refused to compromise even under pressure from his own father. "Why?" Kale asked quietly. "Why risk everything for an Omega you barely know?" Rhaegar held his gaze for a long moment. In the darkness of Beta Aldrich's bedroom, with moonlight streaming through the window and the weight of conspiracy pressing down on them both, something passed between them, something that had been building since their first confrontation in the detention cell. Recognition, understanding, connection. "Because you remind me that wolves can be more than what the pack tells them they are," Rhaegar said softly. "And because I'm tired of watching innocent wolves die so guilty, ones can sleep comfortably." Before Kale could respond, Rhaegar moved to the window. "Come on. We need to get back before someone notices we're both missing." They slipped out of the chambers the same way they'd entered, silent, swift, disappearing into the packhouse's shadows like ghosts who'd never existed at all. But as they navigated the dark corridors back to Kale's temporary quarters, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. He'd found an ally in the most unlikely place. He'd discovered evidence pointing toward the real killer. And he'd overheard a conversation that suggested the conspiracy ran deeper than he'd imagined. 2 days left, 48 hours to catch a murderer and expose a cover-up before Kale faced execution. The clock was ticking, but for the first time since this nightmare began, Kale felt like he might actually survive. Chapter 6. The Trap Within a Trap. Kale didn't sleep that night. He lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the overheard conversation between Alpha Castor, Ivan Volkov, and Dmitri. Every word, every inflection, every pause had been laden with meaning and with threat. Ivan was hiding something. Castor knew or suspected the truth, but was allowing the convenient narrative to proceed. And Dmitri was playing his part perfectly, the loyal son supporting his father's schemes while making sure the scapegoat stayed properly blamed. It was elegant, really, almost admirable in its calculated cruelty. Almost. Dawn came gray and cold, the kind of morning that promised rain, but never quite delivered. Kyle was already awake when the guards brought his breakfast, more generous rations. As if feeding him well would somehow make his impending execution more palatable. He forced himself to eat anyway. He'd need the energy for what was coming. Lena arrived an hour later, ostensibly to collect the breakfast tray, but actually to pass along information. "There's talk," she said quietly, her back to the guards as she busied herself with the dishes. About you and the alpha heir. People are saying he's been spending too much time helping you, that it's inappropriate, that he's letting personal feelings cloud his judgment. Personal feelings? Kael kept his voice equally low. I barely know him. Doesn't matter what's true. Matters what people think. Lena's dark eyes met his briefly. Ivan Volkov's been spreading rumors, subtle ones, suggesting that Ryagar's investigation is motivated by something other than justice. That maybe there's history between you two, connections the pack doesn't know about. Kael's stomach dropped. He's trying to discredit Ryagar. Make sure that even if we find evidence, people won't believe it because they'll think he's biased. Exactly. Lena straightened, raising her voice to a normal level for the guard's benefit. I'll be back this evening with dinner. Try to stay out of trouble. She left, and Kael was alone again with his thoughts and his growing certainty that they were running out of time faster than anticipated. Ivan was moving, consolidating his position, making sure that even if the truth came out, he'd have enough planted doubt to survive the revelation. They needed to act today, not tomorrow. Today. Ryagar appeared just before noon, dismissing the guards with a curt command and closing the door behind him. He looked like he hadn't slept either. Dark circles shadowed his golden eyes, and his usual immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, his hair tied back hastily, his clothing functional rather than formal. We have a problem, Ryagar said without preamble. Just one? Kael's attempt at dark humor fell flat. Ivan's locked down his office. New wards, additional guards, restricted access even for wolves who usually have clearance. Ryagar paced the small room like a caged predator. He's cleaning house, destroying evidence, making sure we can't find anything that ties him to the murder. Then we need another approach. Kael stood, his mind racing through possibilities. If we can't get to his office, we find someone who can. Someone who has legitimate access and might be willing to help us. Like who? Anyone with that kind of access is either loyal to Ivan or too afraid of him to risk betrayal. Not everyone. Kael thought back to the trial, to the witnesses who'd testified against him. What about the servant? Marta, the one who claimed she saw me near the private quarters? Ryagar's expression sharpened. You think she lied? I know she lied. I wasn't there, which means someone convinced her to lie, either through payment or intimidation. Kael's hands clenched into fists. If it was intimidation, maybe we can convince her to tell the truth. Offer her protection in exchange for testimony about who pressured her. That's risky. If she was paid, she'll have no reason to turn on Ivan. And if she was threatened, approaching her might just get her killed to silence her permanently. Do we have a better option? Ryagar stopped pacing, his golden eyes locking onto Kael's. For a long moment, he simply looked at him, weighing, calculating, deciding. Then he nodded. We talked to Marta, but carefully. And if this goes wrong, if she reports us or warns Ivan, then we're out of time and options anyway, Kael finished. So we'd better make sure it doesn't go wrong. They found Marta in the pack house kitchens during the afternoon lull between lunch service and dinner preparation. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with graying hair pulled into a tight bun and hands that bore the calluses of decades of domestic work. When Ryagar and Kael entered the kitchen, her face went pale and her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped the pot she was scrubbing. Alpha heir, she stammered, dropping into a hasty bow. I wasn't expecting. Relax, Marta. Ryagar's voice was gentle, but firm. We just need to speak with you, privately. Marta's eyes darted to the other servants working in the kitchen, then back to Ryagar. I'm on duty. I can't just... You can, and you will. Not a request. A command, delivered with enough alpha authority that Marta's wolf couldn't help but submit. They led her to a small storage room off the main kitchen. Ryagar posted himself by the door, blocking any exit. Kael stood in the center of the cramped space, surrounded by sacks of flour and hanging herbs. trying to look non-threatening despite the fact that he was here to extract a confession from a terrified woman. "Marta," Kael said softly, "I need you to tell me the truth about what you saw the day Beta Aldrich died." "I already told the truth." Her voice was barely a whisper. "At the trial, I saw you near the private quarters. I told the council." "You told them what someone instructed you to say." Kael kept his tone gentle, non-accusatory. "I'm not here to punish you. I'm not here to hurt you. I just need to know who told you to lie." Tears welled in Marta's eyes. "I can't. They'll kill you," Rhaegar finished quietly. "That's what you were threatened with, wasn't it? Testify against the Omega, or face consequences. Maybe not just for you. Maybe for your family too." Marta's face crumpled. The tears spilled over, tracking down her weathered cheeks. "My daughter. She lives in the outer territories with her mate and their pups. Beta Volkov said, he said if I didn't testify, accidents could happen, rogues could attack, protections could be withdrawn." Kael's rage flared white-hot. They'd threatened this woman's grandchildren, used her love for her family as a weapon to force her into perjury. "Which Volkov?" Rhaegar asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Ivan or Dmitri?" "Dmitri came to me." Marta's hands twisted in her apron, but he was carrying his father's authority. Everyone knows Beta Ivan controls that family. The son is just the instrument. "What exactly did Dmitri tell you to say?" "That I saw the Omega, saw him." She gestured at Kael without meeting his eyes. "Near the private quarters that afternoon. Loitering like he had no business being there, looking suspicious. Dmitri gave me specific times, specific details, told me exactly what to tell the council." "And you never actually saw me," Kael said. "No." Marta's voice broke. I'm so sorry, but my daughter, my grandpups, they're all I have. I couldn't let them be hurt. I couldn't. It's okay." The words surprised Kael even as he spoke them. This woman had helped frame him for murder, had stood before the council and lied about his guilt. But looking at her now, terrified, trapped, forced to choose between her conscience and her family's safety, Kael couldn't find it in himself to hate her. "You were protecting your family. I understand." Rhaegar stepped forward. "Marta, I'm going to ask you to do something very difficult. I need you to recant your testimony. To tell the council that you lied, that you were coerced by the Volkovs. I know it's dangerous. I know it puts you and your family at risk. But I swear to you, on my honor as Alpha Heir, on the moon herself, that I will protect you. Your daughter, your grandchildren, everyone you love. They'll be placed under my personal protection, and anyone who tries to harm them will answer to me directly." Marta stared at him, hope and terror warring in her expression. "You'd do that? For a servant? For an Omega accused of murder?" "For justice," Rhaegar corrected. "Because the Pack's laws mean nothing if we only apply them when it's convenient, and because innocent wolves don't deserve to die protecting guilty ones." The silence stretched. Kael could practically hear Marta's thoughts racing, weighing the risks, calculating the odds, trying to decide if the Alpha Heir's promise was worth betting her family's lives on. Finally, she nodded. "I'll testify. I'll tell them everything, but I want my daughter brought here first, to the Pack House, under your direct protection, before I say a word to the council." "Done." Rhaegar's response was immediate. "I'll send guards to retrieve her within the hour. She and her family will be housed in the secured quarters until this is resolved." "Then," Marta took a shuddering breath, "then I'll tell the truth, all of it." They left Marta in the storage room with instructions to continue her work as if nothing had happened. Rhaegar immediately dispatched his most trusted guards to retrieve Marta's daughter and family, with orders to keep the mission quiet and move quickly. "That's one witness recanted," Rhaegar said as they walked through the corridors back toward Kael's quarters. "But it's not enough. The council will just claim she's being coerced by us, the same way she was coerced by the Volkovs. We need physical evidence, something that directly ties Ivan to the murder. The threatening letter proves motive, not action. We need more. Ryagar stopped walking, his expression hardening with determination. Tonight, we search Ivan's quarters. I don't care how well guarded they are. We're running out of time, and he's had a full day to destroy evidence. If we wait any longer, there'll be nothing left to find. Kael nodded. He'd known it would come to this, one final, desperate gamble with everything on the line. What time? He asked. Midnight. The guard rotation changes then. We'll have a 15-minute window when the hallways are least monitored. Ryagar's golden eyes met his. And Kael? If we're caught, I can't protect you from the consequences. Breaking into a beta's quarters while under investigation for murder? The council will see it as proof of guilt. They'll execute you immediately. Then we won't get caught. Ryagar's lips curved into that fierce half-smile Kael was beginning to recognize. Confident words. I learned from the best. They stood there in the corridor, two wolves from opposite ends of the pack hierarchy, united by a shared determination to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Get some rest, Ryagar said finally. You'll need it. Tonight is going to be dangerous. He turned to leave, then paused. Kael, thank you. For what? For not hating Marta. For understanding that she was a victim too. Ryagar's expression softened slightly. A lot of wolves in your position would want revenge on everyone who testified against them, but you saw her humanity. That's rare, and it says something about who you are. Before Kael could respond, Ryagar was gone, disappearing down the corridor with that predatory grace that made him seem more wolf than man. Kael returned to his quarters in a daze. They had a recanted witness. They had a plan for tonight. They had less than 36 hours until his execution deadline. Everything was coming to a head. He tried to rest, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. Every scenario played out in his head. Successful infiltration, getting caught, finding evidence, finding nothing, confronting Ivan, being killed before they could reveal the truth. So many ways this could go wrong, but only one way it could go right. Lena brought dinner as promised, along with news. The pack's in an uproar, she said quietly as she set down the tray. Word spread that Ryagar's been investigating independently. Some wolves think he's being noble. Others think he's being naive. And there's a growing faction, led by Ivan Volkov's supporters, who think he's overstepping his authority and undermining his father's judgment. Ivan's building a narrative, Kael said grimly, making sure that if we do expose him, enough wolves will doubt the evidence to let him survive politically. Can you prove he did it? Before tomorrow's deadline? We're going to try. Lena gripped his hand suddenly, her eyes fierce. Be careful. Whatever you're planning for tonight, because I know that look, and I know you're planning something, just be careful. The pack needs wolves like you. Wolves who won't accept injustice just because it's easier. Don't die proving a point. I'll do my best, Kael promised. She left, and the hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. 10 o'clock, 11, 11:30. Finally, at 1:45, a soft knock came at his door. Ryagar stood in the hallway, dressed entirely in black, his hair tied back, his expression all business. Ready? He asked quietly. Kael nodded, even though his heart was hammering, and his wolf was whining with anxiety, and every instinct screamed that this was a terrible idea. They slipped out into the darkened corridors, two shadows moving through a sleeping pack house, heading toward Ivan Volkov's quarters, and whatever truths, or deaths, waited there. The hunt for the real killer had reached its most dangerous phase, and there would be no turning back. Chapter 7. The Evidence. Ivan Volkov's quarters were located in the west wing of the pack house, the section reserved for high-ranking betas and their families. Unlike the Alpha's private chambers with their ancient stone and ceremonial grandeur, this wing was newer, more opulent, designed to showcase wealth rather than heritage. Rhaegar and Chaol moved through the darkness like wraiths, avoiding the main corridors and using the servants' passages that honeycombed the packhouse's interior. The Alpha Heir knew every hidden route, every blind spot in the guard patrols, every weakness in the building's security. It was almost frightening how thoroughly he'd studied the packhouse's vulnerabilities. They paused at a junction where two corridors met, pressing themselves against the wall as footsteps echoed from somewhere nearby. A guard making his rounds, his boots heavy against the marble floor. They waited, barely breathing, until the sound faded into the distance. "His quarters are just ahead," Rhaegar whispered. "Two guards at the main entrance, but there's a service entrance through the adjacent storage room that connects to his private study. The wards are weaker there. He focused most of his magical defenses on the main door." "Can you break the wards without alerting him?" "I can disrupt them long enough for us to get in, but once we're inside, we'll have maybe 10 minutes before the magical signature alerts someone that they've been tampered with." Rhaegar's golden eyes gleamed in the darkness. "We find what we need and get out. No time for thorough searching. We grab anything that looks suspicious and sort through it later." Chaol nodded, his pulse racing. 10 minutes, 600 seconds to find evidence that would prove Ivan Volkov murdered his uncle and framed an innocent Omega. No pressure. They crept down the final corridor to a narrow door marked with symbols indicating it led to a storage area. Rhaegar produced a set of lockpicks. Where he'd gotten them, Chaol didn't ask, and made quick work of the simple mechanical lock. The door swung open silently, revealing a cramped space filled with cleaning supplies, spare linens, and the detritus of wealthy wolves who never had to manage their own households. And at the far end, another door, this one sealed with glowing magical wards that pulsed with a faint blue light. Rhaegar approached the warded door, his hands moving in complex patterns as he murmured words in the old language, the tongue of the first wolves, before packs and territories and civilization. Magic crackled in the air, making Chaol's hair stand on end and his wolf whine with instinctive unease. The wards flickered, dimmed, finally went dark. "Now!" Rhaegar hissed, and they slipped through the door into Ivan Volkov's private study. The study was exactly what Chaol expected from a wolf of Ivan's status: expensive everything. Imported furniture, rare books bound in leather, a massive desk carved from a single piece of mahogany, display cases holding trophies and artifacts from successful business ventures, and everywhere the scent of silver-leaf tobacco and expensive cologne that marked this space as undeniably Ivan's territory. "Search fast," Rhaegar commanded, moving immediately to the desk. "Correspondence first. Anything dated around the time of the murder, financial records, personal journals, anything that might—" He stopped mid-sentence, his hand frozen on one of the desk drawers. "What?" Chaol asked, moving to his side. Rhaegar pulled the drawer open fully, revealing its contents. Inside, nestled among routine documents and writing supplies, was a small wooden box. Unremarkable at first glance, but when Rhaegar lifted it carefully, the scent hit them both. Blood. Old blood. And beneath it, the metallic tang of silver. Rhaegar opened the box. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a knife. The blade was clean now, scrubbed free of evidence, but Chaol's enhanced senses could still detect traces of what it had been used for. The cloth itself was stained. Dark patches that had once been red now faded to brown. "Is that—" Chaol's voice caught in his throat. "The murder weapon." Rhaegar's tone was ice-cold fury. "Or at least a murder weapon. We'd need to test it to be certain, but why else would Ivan have a blood-stained knife hidden in his private desk?" "He kept it." Disbelief and vindication warred in Chaol's chest. "He killed your uncle and kept the weapon. Why would he—" "Insurance," Rhaegar said grimly. "If someone else got blamed, like you did, he'd have leverage, proof he could use to blackmail or manipulate if needed, or maybe he's just arrogant enough to believe he'd never be caught." Chaol stared at the knife, his mind reeling. This was it, the physical evidence they needed, proof that Ivan Volkov was connected to the murder. "We need to keep searching," Rhaegar said, carefully rewrapping the knife and placing the box on the desk. If he kept the weapon, there might be other evidence, documents, plans, something that explains why he did this. They tore through the study with renewed urgency. Rhaegar took the desk and filing cabinets while Kyle searched the bookshelves and display cases, looking for anything hidden or out of place. 5 minutes passed, then 6. Kael's hands shook as he pulled books from their shelves, checking behind them for concealed compartments or hidden documents. Nothing. 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 Just expensive leather bindings and pages about pack history and trade negotiations, and his fingers brushed against something odd, a book that didn't sit quite right on its shelf. When he pulled it out, he discovered it wasn't a real book at all, just a hollow facade designed to hide a small space behind it. Inside the space was a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon. "Rhaegar," Kael breathed. "I found something." The alpha heir was at his side in an instant. Kael untied the ribbon with trembling fingers and spread the letters across the desk beside the knife. They were all addressed to Ivan Volkov, all from different wolves, some within the Moonshadow Pack, others from neighboring territories, and all of them discussed the same topic: Beta Aldrich's bid for the council seat, and how his success would be problematic for their various interests. "These are conspirators," Rhaegar said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Ivan wasn't working alone. He had support from multiple wolves who wanted my uncle dead." Kael scanned the letters quickly, his trained memory cataloging names and details. Helena Blackthorn had written expressing concern that Aldrich's council seat would give him authority over intelligence operations. Victor Stormwind had worried that Aldrich would interfere with military border policies. Even a few wolves from other packs had chimed in, worried about how Aldrich's promised alliances might shift territorial power dynamics. But the most damning letter was the last one, written in Ivan's own hand, a draft never sent but carefully preserved. "The problem has been handled. The Omega has been framed successfully, and no one suspects our involvement. With Aldrich gone, the council seat is yours for the taking, Helena. As we agreed, you'll support my trade initiatives in exchange. The pack will never know what we sacrificed to protect our interests." Kael's hands clenched around the letter, creasing the expensive paper. "He's confessing. He's literally confessing to framing me and murdering your uncle, and he kept the confession like a trophy." "That's not a confession," a cold voice said from the doorway. "That's a death warrant. For both of you." Kael and Rhaegar spun around. Ivan Volkov stood in the entrance to his study, flanked by 2 of his personal guards. He was dressed in a silk robe, his gray hair disheveled from sleep, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. Behind him, Dmitri emerged from the shadows, a satisfied smirk on his perfect face. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice when my wards were tampered with?" Ivan asked conversationally. "The moment you broke through, alarms were triggered. I've been watching you search my study for the past 7 minutes, wondering what you'd find. And I must say, I'm impressed you found the knife. I'd hidden it rather well." Rhaegar stepped forward, his body positioning itself slightly in front of Kael. "You killed Beta Aldrich. You framed an innocent wolf for murder, and you've been conspiring with other high-ranking pack members to cover it up." "I removed a political obstacle," Ivan corrected, "and I ensured that the blame fell on someone whose death wouldn't matter. An Omega, disposable, convenient." His eyes flicked to Kael. "Nothing personal, boy. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, technically, you weren't in any place at any time, but you had the right profile for a scapegoat." "You threatened Marta's family," Kael said, his voice shaking with rage. "You made her lie under oath. You perverted justice to protect yourself." "I protected my interests, as any smart wolf would do." Ivan's expression remained coldly amused. "And now you've broken into my quarters, stolen my personal property, and violated about a dozen pack laws. Even if you tried to present this so-called evidence, who would believe you? The word of a condemned Omega and an alpha heir who's clearly lost his objectivity?" "The knife proves," Rhaegar started. "The knife proves nothing," It's a knife, with old blood on it. Could be from any hunt, any accident. You have no witnesses placing me at the scene, no concrete timeline, just circumstantial evidence and conspiracy theories. Ivan's smile was predatory. And now you've made yourselves criminals by breaking into a beta's private quarters. The council will have you both executed. Dmitri stepped forward, his golden hair gleaming even in the dim light. I told you, Father. The Omega was always going to be too stupid to accept his fate gracefully. And Rhaegar, he shook his head with mock sadness. Cousin, you've thrown away your reputation, your honor, your future as Alpha, all for a wolf who means nothing. It's almost tragic. He means more than you ever will, Rhaegar snarled, and Chaol felt something warm bloom in his chest, despite the dire circumstances. Ivan gestured to his guards. Take them both. Bring them to the Alpha. Let Castor deal with his disappointing son and the murderous Omega who corrupted him. The guards moved forward, their hands reaching for weapons. Rhaegar's hand went to the knife at his belt. We're not going quietly. Neither am I, Chaol said, his wolf surging forward. Silver manacles be damned. If he was going to die anyway, he'd die fighting. But before either of them could make a move, before Ivan's guards could close the distance, a voice rang out from behind the Volkovs. Nobody move. Everyone froze. Alpha Castor Silverclaw stepped into the doorway, flanked by 6 of his personal guard. His expression was unreadable, his cold eyes sweeping across the scene, his son and the accused Omega standing in a beta's ransacked study, the beta and his son blocking their exit, evidence of conspiracy and murder spread across the desk. Father, Rhaegar began, I can explain. I'm sure you can. Castor's voice was soft. Deadly. And you will. But first, he turned to Ivan Volkov. Ivan, I believe you and I need to have a conversation about treason, murder, and the consequences of thinking you're clever enough to fool an Alpha. The color drained from Ivan's face. Alpha, I don't know what you think you heard, but I heard everything. Castor held up a small device, magical tech that Chaol vaguely recognized as a recording crystal, designed to capture sound and preserve it for later playback. Your wards may have alerted you when they were breached, but my wards alerted me when you activated yours. I've been listening to this entire conversation, including your confession to murdering my brother and framing an innocent pack member. The silence that followed was deafening. Ivan's face went from pale to gray to a shade of green that suggested he might actually vomit. Dmitri took a step backward, his confident smirk dissolving into dawning horror. You set us up, Ivan whispered. I gave you enough rope to hang yourself, Castor corrected coldly. When Rhaegar came to me this morning requesting permission to investigate Ivan Volkov, despite my orders to let the case proceed as planned, I realized my son believed in your innocence strongly enough to risk everything. He looked at Chaol, and for the first time, there was something almost like respect in his ice-cold eyes. That made me wonder if perhaps I'd been too quick to accept the easy answer. Please like this video if Chaol's fight for justice moved you. Rhaegar stared at his father. You knew. This whole time you suspected. I suspected many things, but I needed proof. Evidence that would hold up before the council and the pack. Evidence that could only be obtained if Ivan believed he'd won. If he thought you two were desperate enough to break into his quarters and incriminate yourselves. Castor's expression remained cold. So I let you investigate. I let you make your moves, and I waited to see who would reveal themselves. The recording, Chaol said slowly, understanding dawning. You knew we'd confront Ivan. You knew he'd confess if he thought he'd already won. Precisely. Castor gestured to his guards. Arrest Beta Ivan Volkov and his son Dmitri on charges of murder, conspiracy, perjury, and treason against the pack. They'll stand trial before the full council tomorrow, and this time the evidence will be considerably less ambiguous. The guards moved forward. Ivan and Dmitri were seized, their protests and denials falling on deaf ears as they were dragged from the study in manacles. When they were gone, Castor turned to Rhaegar and Chaol. You both broke pack law tonight. You violated another wolf's privacy, stole his property, and conducted an unauthorized investigation that could have ended in disaster. Rhaegar straightened, his expression defiant. I'd do it again. Justice matters more than protocol. I know. And for the first time, Castor smiled, a cold, proud expression that transformed his severe face. You've proven yourself tonight, my son. Not as a warrior or a politician, but as a wolf who will fight for what's right even when it's difficult, even when your own father stands in your way. That's the kind of strength we need in our next alpha. He turned to Chaol. And you, Omega. You stood accused of murder, faced with execution, abandoned by the pack, and you still fought for the truth. You didn't beg for mercy. You demanded justice. That takes a kind of courage most wolves, regardless of rank, will never possess. Chaol didn't know what to say. After days of being treated like a disposable criminal, of being told his life meant nothing, having the Alpha himself acknowledge his worth felt surreal. The charges against you are dropped, Castor continued. You'll be formally exonerated before the pack tomorrow when Ivan and Dmitri stand trial. You'll also receive compensation for your wrongful imprisonment and a formal apology from the council. I don't want compensation, Chaol said quietly. I just want my life back. You'll have that, and more, if you're smart. Castor's eyes gleamed with calculation. A wolf who can survive what you've survived, who can outthink wolves who've spent decades accumulating power, that's a wolf who could go far in this pack, if he chose to. It wasn't quite an offer, but it was something close. An acknowledgement that Chaol was more than his rank suggested, that he had value beyond the label the pack had assigned him at birth. Come, Castor said, turning toward the door. We have much to do before dawn. Statements to record, evidence to catalog, a trial to prepare. He strode from the study, his guards following. Rhaegar and Chaol stood alone in Ivan's ransacked quarters, surrounded by evidence of conspiracy and murder, both of them still processing what had just happened. Your father set all of this up, Chaol said finally. He let me suffer, let me face execution, just so he could catch Ivan in a confession. He did. Rhaegar's jaw was tight, and I don't know if I should be impressed or furious. Both? Chaol suggested weakly. Both, Rhaegar agreed. He turned to face Chaol fully, and something in his expression made Chaol's breath catch. You survived, Chaol. Against impossible odds, you survived. And you proved that Omegas can be just as strong, just as clever, just as worthy as any alpha. I had help, Chaol said softly. From you. You risked everything to help me. Why? Rhaegar was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and took Chaol's hand, a simple gesture that somehow carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. Because you reminded me what courage looks like, Rhaegar said. Because you made me want to be the kind of alpha who deserves wolves like you in his pack. And because... He hesitated, something vulnerable flickering in his golden eyes. Because I see you, Chaol. Not your rank, not your designation. You. And what I see is worth protecting. Chaol's heart hammered in his chest. This was dangerous territory, an alpha heir and an omega standing too close in the darkness, hands intertwined, something building between them that could never be acknowledged in the harsh light of pack politics. But in that moment, surrounded by evidence of corruption and conspiracy, having just survived a plot designed to end his life, Chaol didn't care about danger. I see you too, he whispered. And for just a moment, before they had to return to reality and rank and the weight of pack expectations, they stood together in the darkness. Two wolves who'd found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. Two wolves who'd changed each other's lives forever. Chapter 8. The Trial of Traitors. Dawn broke over the Moonshadow Pack territory with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything feel sharp and significant. Chaol stood at the window of his quarters, No longer a prison, now just a temporary room until he figured out what came next, and watched the sun climb above the eastern mountains. He'd been awake all night. After leaving Ivan's study, he and Rhaegar had spent hours giving statements to Alpha Castor's personal investigators, cataloging evidence, and preparing for the trial that would begin in a few hours. The trial where Ivan and Dmitry Volkov would face justice for murder and conspiracy. The trial that would finally, officially, clear Kael's name. He should have felt relieved, vindicated, triumphant. Instead, he felt hollow, exhausted, and strangely uncertain about what his life would look like now that he wasn't fighting for survival every second. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Lena burst through the doorway, her face split by a smile so wide it looked painful. She didn't say a word, just crossed the room in 3 strides and threw her arms around Kael in a fierce hug. "You're alive," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "You're actually alive and free, and I can't believe it actually worked." Kael hugged her back, feeling some of the hollowness ease slightly. "I had help, a lot of help." "From the Alpha heir, I heard." Lena pulled back, her dark eyes gleaming with curiosity and something else, calculation maybe. "The whole pack's talking about it, how Rhaegar Silverclaw spent days investigating on your behalf, how he broke into Ivan Volkov's quarters with you, how Alpha Castor recorded everything and caught the real killers." She paused. "They're also talking about how Rhaegar looked at you during the investigation, like you were something precious, something worth protecting." Heat crept up Kael's neck. He was just doing what was right, seeking justice. "Uh-huh." Lena's expression said she wasn't buying it for a second. "And the part where he held your hand in Ivan's study? Also just justice? You weren't even there, how do you—" "One of the Alpha's guards is mated to a kitchen worker. Word travels fast." Lena's smile turned knowing. "I'm not judging, Kael. I'm just saying, the Alpha heir doesn't risk his reputation and future for just anyone. Something happened between you two. Something beyond the investigation." Kael wanted to deny it. Wanted to brush it off as gratitude or circumstance or anything other than what it actually was. A connection that had formed in the darkness, built on mutual respect and growing attraction, and the kind of recognition that happened when 2 souls saw each other clearly for the first time. But lying to Lena felt pointless. "I don't know what it is," he admitted quietly, "or what it means, or if it's even real, or just the intensity of the situation making us feel things that won't survive normal life. But yes, something happened." "Good." Lena squeezed his arm. "You deserve something good. After everything you've been through, you deserve to be seen and valued and maybe even loved." Loved. The word hung in the air like a promise and a threat. Before Kael could respond, another knock sounded, firmer this time, more authoritative. Rhaegar stepped into the room, and Kael's breath caught despite himself. The Alpha heir was dressed in full formal regalia, black and silver ceremonial robes that marked him as heir to the pack, his dark hair pulled back to reveal the sharp planes of his face, his golden eyes blazing with intensity. He looked every inch the future Alpha, powerful and commanding and absolutely magnetic. "Lena," Rhaegar said politely, "would you give us a moment?" "Of course, Alpha heir." Lena shot Kael one more significant look, then slipped out of the room, closing the door behind her. Leaving Kael alone with Rhaegar for the first time since last night's revelations. "The trial begins in an hour," Rhaegar said. "I wanted to check on you before we go into the Grand Court. Make sure you're prepared for what's coming." "I think I can handle watching the wolves who framed me face justice," Kael said dryly. "It's not the justice part I'm worried about." Rhaegar moved closer, his expression serious. "When we walk into that court, the entire pack will be watching. They'll see us together. They'll remember that I helped you, that I believed in you when no one else did. And they'll talk, make assumptions. Some of those assumptions will be accurate." Kael's pulse quickened. "Is that a problem?" "For me? No. My position is secure. I'm the Alpha's heir. My father has made it clear he approves of how I handled the investigation." Rhaegar's jaw tightened. "But for you? An Omega who's already been through hell? Having the pack speculate about a connection between us could make your life difficult. Some wolves will be jealous. Others will be disgusted. The pack's hierarchy doesn't look kindly on alphas and omegas forming bonds outside the traditional power structures." Traditional power structures, a diplomatic way of saying that alphas were supposed to mate with other alphas, strengthening bloodlines and consolidating power. Omegas were supposed to stay in their lane, accept their designated roles, and never aspire to anything beyond subservience. The idea that an alpha heir and an omega could be equals, could choose each other, could build something real despite the pack's expectations, that was revolutionary, dangerous, potentially destructive to everything the pack's hierarchy was built on. "So what are you saying?" Kale asked quietly. "That we should pretend last night didn't happen? That whatever this is between us should stay hidden?" "I'm saying I want you to choose." Rhaegar stepped closer, near enough that Kale could smell cedar and smoke, could see the flecks of darker gold in his eyes. "I won't hide what I feel. I won't pretend you don't matter to me. But I also won't force you into a position where you're constantly defending yourself against wolves who think you've overstepped. So you need to decide, do you want this? Whatever this is becoming? Even knowing it'll make your life harder?" Kale's mind raced through the implications. If he said yes, if he acknowledged that something real was building between them, he'd be declaring himself worthy of an alpha's attention. He'd be challenging centuries of pack tradition. He'd be painting a target on his back for every wolf who believed omegas should know their place. But if he said no, if he walked away from this connection to protect himself from potential backlash, he'd be proving the pack right, proving that omegas were too weak, too afraid, too resigned to their fate to reach for something better. And Kale was so damn tired of proving the pack right. "I want this," he said firmly. "Whatever it is, whatever it becomes. I'm not going to hide or apologize for being seen by someone who actually values me." Something fierce and triumphant blazed in Rhaegar's eyes. "Then stand with me, in the court, in front of the pack. Stand as my equal, not my charity case. Show them that you're not just the Omega who survived, you're the wolf who changed everything. I can do that. I know you can." Rhaegar's hand came up, hesitating for just a moment before cupping Kale's face. "You're stronger than any of them realize. It's one of the things He stopped himself, something vulnerable flickering across his expression. "One of the things you what?" Kale prompted softly. "One of the things I'm learning to admire about you," Rhaegar finished, but Kale heard the words he hadn't said. "One of the things I'm learning to love about you. Too soon, too fast, too dangerous to speak aloud, but it hung between them anyway, unspoken and undeniable." The Grand Court was even more packed than it had been for Kale's trial. Every wolf in the territory who could secure a seat had done so. The tiered seating overflowed with spectators hungry for drama and justice in equal measure. The air buzzed with conversation and speculation and the electric anticipation that came before something significant happened. Kale entered the court at Rhaegar's side, and the effect was immediate. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, heads turned, eyes widened. Murmurs rippled through the assembled wolves like a physical wave. The Omega who'd been accused of murder was walking into the court beside the Alpha heir, not behind him like a servant or supplicant, beside him as an equal. Kale kept his head high and his expression calm, channeling every ounce of the courage that had gotten him through the past days. He would not cower, would not apologize for existing in spaces where Omegas weren't supposed to stand. They took their positions near the council platform. Rhaegar stood at his father's right hand, the traditional position for the heir. And Kale stood beside Rhaegar, claiming space that no Omega in the pack's history had ever occupied during a formal trial. It was a statement, a declaration, and everyone in the court understood it. Alpha Caster rose from his throne, and the chamber fell silent instantly. We are gathered for the trial of Beta Ivan Volkov and his son Dmitry Volkov, accused of murder, conspiracy, perjury, and treason against the Moonshadow Pack. His voice carried to every corner of the massive space, cold and absolute. The evidence against them is substantial, the charges are severe, and the punishment, if they are found guilty, will be death. More murmurs, louder this time. Death sentences for high-ranking wolves were rare, usually reserved for crimes so heinous that no alternative existed. This qualified. "Bring forth the accused," Castor commanded. Guards dragged Ivan and Dmitry into the center of the chamber. Both wore silver manacles. Both looked haggard, their earlier confidence and arrogance stripped away by a night in the detention cells. Ivan's expensive clothing was rumpled. Dmitry's golden hair hung limp and disheveled. They looked exactly like what they were, criminals caught and cornered, with no escape and no hope. "The council has reviewed the evidence," Castor continued. "Correspondence proving conspiracy, a murder weapon found in the accused's possession, testimony from a witness who was coerced into perjury, and most damning, a recorded confession from Beta Ivan Volkov himself, admitting to the murder of Beta Aldrich Silverclaw and the deliberate framing of an innocent pack member." Castor gestured, and one of the council members activated the recording crystal. Ivan's voice filled the chamber, preserved perfectly by the magical device. "I removed a political obstacle, and I ensured that the blame fell on someone whose death wouldn't matter, an Omega, disposable, convenient." The court erupted, shouts of outrage, gasps of shock. Wolves who'd believed in Ivan's innocence now confronted with undeniable proof of his guilt. "Silence!" Castor's command cut through the chaos. "The accused will now have the opportunity to speak in their own defense. Beta Ivan Volkov, what do you say to these charges?" Ivan raised his head slowly, his eyes sweeping across the court. For a moment, Kale thought he might confess, might accept his fate with some shred of dignity. Instead, Ivan laughed. It was a bitter, broken sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Defense? What defense can I offer against my own recorded words? Against evidence planted by the Alpha himself to trap me?" His eyes found Castor, blazing with impotent fury. "You wanted me gone. You've wanted all of us gone. Everyone who challenged your absolute authority, who dared to build power independent of your control. So you used your son's misguided investigation and an Omega's convenient innocence to eliminate your political rivals." The accusation hung in the air like poison. "You claim I orchestrated this trial to eliminate rivals?" Castor's voice was dangerously soft. "Ivan, you murdered my brother. You framed an innocent wolf for your crime. You conspired with others to pervert justice. These are facts, not political maneuvering." "Facts you've twisted to serve your purposes." Ivan's voice rose to a shout. "Yes, I killed Aldrich, because he was weak, because he would have sold out our pack's interests to foreign wolves for political gain. I did what was necessary to protect our territory, our power, our future, and I'd do it again." The court exploded into chaos. Half the wolves shouted in outrage at Ivan's confession and his complete lack of remorse. The other half argued about his justification, debating whether political murder could ever be acceptable if it served the pack's interests. Kale watched it all with a strange detachment. Ivan truly believed he'd been in the right, that his actions were justified, that sacrificing an Omega and murdering a Beta were acceptable costs for protecting his vision of the pack's future. It was the mindset of a wolf who'd spent so long at the top of the hierarchy that he'd forgotten lower-ranked wolves were actual people, not pieces on a game board, not convenient scapegoats. People with lives and worth and the right to exist without being sacrificed for political convenience. "Enough!" Castor's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "The accused has confessed. His guilt is established beyond any doubt. The council will now deliberate on punishment." The 7 council members bent their heads together, conferring in low voices. It didn't take long. The evidence was overwhelming. The confession was explicit. There was only one possible outcome. Finally, the head counselor stood. The council finds Beta Ivan Volkov and Dmitry Volkov guilty of all charges. The sentence is death by execution, to be carried out at dawn tomorrow. Additionally, the Volkov family name is stripped of all rank and privilege. Their assets are forfeit to the pack, and their bloodline is barred from holding any position of authority for 3 generations. Total annihilation. Not just death for the guilty parties, but the complete destruction of their family's legacy. It was harsh, ruthless, absolute. It was justice. Ivan didn't scream or beg. He simply stared at the council with hollow eyes, all his fight drained away. Dmitry, by contrast, collapsed to his knees, his perfect composure finally shattering as the reality of his fate crashed over him. "No," Dmitry whispered. "No, please. I was just following my father's orders. I didn't kill anyone. I just testified. You perjured yourself before the pack," Castor said coldly. "You threatened an innocent woman and her family to secure false testimony. You were complicit in murder and conspiracy. Your guilt is as absolute as your father's." The guards dragged both Volkovs from the chamber as Dmitry's pleas dissolved into incoherent sobbing. When they were gone, Castor turned to Kale. "Kale Brennan, come forward." Kale's heart hammered as he stepped into the center of the chamber, the same spot where he'd stood days ago, accused and condemned, facing what seemed like certain death. "The charges against you are formally dropped," Castor declared. "You are exonerated of all crimes. Furthermore, the pack owes you a debt. You were wrongfully imprisoned, falsely accused, and nearly executed for a crime you did not commit. What compensation do you seek?" Kael took a breath. He'd thought about this moment, about what he'd ask for when, if, his innocence was proven. "I don't want money or status," he said clearly. "I want the pack to remember that an Omega nearly died because he was convenient to blame, to remember that justice only happened because someone was willing to look past rank and actually investigate, and to remember that wolves, regardless of their designation, deserve to be seen as people, not pawns." Silence fell across the court. Then, slowly, starting from the back rows where the Omegas and lower-ranked wolves sat, applause began. Quiet at first, then growing louder, spreading through the tiers until even some of the alphas were nodding in acknowledgement. Castor's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his ice-cold eyes that might have been respect. "Your request is noted," he said, "and perhaps reconsidered. This pack has operated under certain assumptions for generations, assumptions about rank, worth, and who deserves justice. What happened to you, what nearly happened, suggests those assumptions may need examination. It wasn't a promise of reform, wasn't a guarantee that the pack's hierarchy would change, but it was an acknowledgement, a crack in the foundation of tradition, and sometimes that was enough." "This court is adjourned," Castor declared. "Justice has been served. Let the pack move forward in peace." As the assembled wolves began to disperse, Rhaegar moved to Kael's side. "You did it," the alpha heir said quietly. "You survived, proved your innocence, and maybe even started changing minds about what Omegas can be." "We did it," Kael corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this alone." Rhaegar's hand found his, their fingers intertwining in full view of anyone still in the court who cared to look. Let them look, Kael thought. Let them see that an alpha heir and an Omega could stand together, could choose each other, could be equals despite everything the pack's tradition claimed was impossible. Let them see, and let them wonder what else might be possible. Chapter 9. The Aftermath and the Challenge. The days following the trial passed in a blur of adjustment and uncertainty. Ivan and Dmitry Volkov were executed at dawn as sentenced, a private affair attended only by the Alpha, the Council, and a handful of high-ranking witnesses. Kael didn't attend. He'd wanted justice, not vengeance. And watching the wolves who'd tried to destroy him die felt like crossing a line he wasn't ready to cross. Rhaegar had gone, though, As alpha heir, it was his duty to witness the pack's justice being carried out. When he'd returned to find Kyle in the pack house gardens that morning, he'd looked older somehow, harder, the weight of leadership settling more firmly on his shoulders. "It's done," was all he'd said, and Kyle had taken his hand, and they'd sat together in silence while the sun climbed higher and the pack went about its business, as if two wolves hadn't just been killed for crimes that had nearly cost Kyle his life. The Volkov family's assets were distributed according to pack law, some to the Alpha's treasury, some divided among wolves who'd been harmed by Ivan's schemes, and a surprising portion set aside for a fund to support lower-ranked wolves seeking education or advancement. That last part had been Riegar's suggestion, and Castor had approved it with what might have been a hint of pride. Marta and her family had been relocated to protected housing within the pack house grounds, as Riegar had promised. The elderly servant had sought Kale out 2 days after the trial, tears streaming down her face, thanking him for understanding why she'd lied and for not seeking revenge against her. "You have nothing to apologize for," Kale had told her. "You were protecting your family. I understand that completely." "You're a good wolf," Marta had whispered. "Better than most alphas I've known. The pack is lucky to have you." It was one of the kindest things anyone had ever said to him. But not everyone in the pack felt that way. The backlash started small: whispers in corridors, pointed looks in the common areas, conversations that stopped when Kyle entered a room. Some wolves celebrated his exoneration and admired his courage. Others resented that an Omega had disrupted the pack's hierarchy, had exposed corruption in high places, and worst of all, had attracted the Alpha heir's attention and favor. "You're making enemies," Lena warned him one evening as they shared dinner in the kitchens. "Helena Blackthorn's supporters are spreading rumors that you seduced Riegar to manipulate the investigation. Victor Stormwind's people are claiming you're an opportunist trying to climb ranks through deception rather than merit." "Let them talk," Kale said, though the words tasted bitter. "I know the truth. Riegar knows the truth. That's what matters." "Is it?" Lena's dark eyes were concerned. "Kale, you've been living in temporary quarters for almost a week now. You can't go back to the Forge. The Forge Master says your position has been restructured and there's no space for you. You can't return to the Omega housing because half the wolves there are terrified of being associated with you. You're in limbo, and the longer you stay there, the more ammunition you give your enemies." She was right. Kale had been so focused on surviving the trial and processing the aftermath that he hadn't considered what his actual life would look like now. He was exonerated but essentially homeless, cleared of charges but unemployed, free but more isolated than ever. "What am I supposed to do?" The question came out more helpless than he'd intended. "I can't just leave the pack. This is my home, but I don't have a place here anymore." "Then make a new place." Lena reached across the table and gripped his hand. "You've already done the impossible, Kale. You survived a murder charge. You exposed a conspiracy. You made the Alpha heir fall for you. Don't give me that look. Everyone with eyes can see how he watches you. If you can do all that, you can figure out where you belong in this new version of your life." Before Kyle could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the main hall, raised voices, the sound of furniture scraping against stone, the distinctive growls of wolves on the edge of violence. Kyle and Lena exchanged glances, then hurried toward the noise. They arrived to find a crowd gathered in the main hall, forming a rough circle around two wolves facing off in the center. One was a Beta Kyle vaguely recognized, one of Victor Stormwind's supporters, built like a brick wall with scars marking his face and arms from years of border patrol duty. The other was Riegar. The Alpha heir stood with his arms crossed, his expression cold and dangerous, while the Beta, whose name Kale thought might be Garrett, practically vibrated with barely suppressed aggression. "Disrespecting the entire pack," Garrett was saying, his voice carrying across the hall. "You spend your days with an Omega. You elevate him above his station. You let him stand beside you in the Grand Court like he's your equal. It's an insult to every wolf who's earned their rank through strength and dominance." Kale earned his position through intelligence, courage, and integrity, Rhaegar said quietly. Qualities you might consider cultivating instead of flexing your muscles and making threats. I'm not making threats, Alpha Heir. I'm issuing a challenge. Garrett's lips pulled back from his teeth in a snarl. Pack law states that any wolf can challenge another wolf's claim to status or favor. I challenge Kale Brennan's right to stand at your side. I challenge his claim to respect and recognition from this pack. And I demand the traditional resolution, trial by combat. The crowd's murmurs intensified. Trial by combat was an ancient rite, rarely invoked in modern times, but still technically valid under pack law. If Garrett wanted to challenge Kale's position, he could force a physical fight. Winner takes all. Loser accepts defeat, and whatever consequences came with it. That's ridiculous, Rhaegar said, his voice hardening. Kale isn't claiming any formal rank or position. He's not trying to displace anyone. There's nothing to challenge. He's claiming you, Garrett shot back. Your attention, your favor, your protection. Those are resources that belong to wolves who've proven themselves worthy through strength, not omegas who manipulate their way into places they don't belong. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Kale pushed through the crowd before he could think better of it. I accept. Every head turned toward him. Rhaegar's eyes widened in alarm. Kale, no, the Alpha Heir started. I accept the challenge, Kale repeated, stepping into the circle to face Garrett directly. His heart hammered, but his voice remained steady. You want to prove I don't belong? Fine. Let's settle this the traditional way. Garrett's smile was predatory. You're an Omega challenging a Beta to combat. You know how this ends, right? I'm going to break you, humiliate you, show everyone that you're exactly what you've always been. Weak, disposable, nothing. Maybe, Kale said quietly, or maybe you'll learn that strength isn't just about size and rank. Either way, we'll find out. Rhaegar grabbed Kale's arm, pulling him aside while the crowd buzzed with excitement and speculation. This is insane, the Alpha Heir hissed. Garrett outweighs you by at least 60 pounds. He's been trained in combat since childhood. He'll destroy you. Probably, Kale admitted. But if I don't accept, every wolf in this pack will think I'm hiding behind you. That I'm weak. That I don't deserve the respect you've shown me. I have to do this, Rhaegar. I have to prove I can stand on my own. By getting yourself killed? By showing I'm willing to fight for what I believe in. Kale met Rhaegar's golden eyes. You risked everything to help me. The least I can do is risk myself to prove I'm worth that help. Rhaegar looked like he wanted to argue further, like he wanted to forbid the challenge, use his authority to shut this down before it could begin. Yeah. But he didn't, because he understood what Kyle was really saying. This wasn't just about physical combat. This was about Kyle claiming his right to exist in the pack without apologizing for who he was or who he'd connected with. This was about proving that Omegas could be brave, could fight back, could demand respect, even from wolves who'd spent their entire lives believing they were superior. 3 days, Rhaegar said finally. Pack law requires 3 days' notice for formal challenges. That gives you time to prepare. I don't know how to fight. Then I'll teach you. Rhaegar's expression was fierce and determined. Every dirty trick, every advantage you can exploit. You're smaller and lighter, which means you're faster. We'll use that. Build a strategy around speed and unpredictability rather than trying to match his strength. You'd train me? Even knowing I might lose anyway? Especially knowing you might lose. Rhaegar's hand came up to cup Kale's face, a gesture that made the watching crowd murmur even louder. Because win or lose, you deserve to walk into that challenge with every advantage I can give you. Garrett's voice cut through their moment. 3 days then. We fight in the training grounds at dawn, and when I win, the Omega goes back to where he belongs, silent, invisible, and far away from the Alpha's air. And when I win? Kale called back, surprising himself with the boldness. Garrett laughed. If you win, which you won't, I'll personally advocate for Omega rights before the council. I'll spend the next year arguing that your kind deserves better treatment, but that's not going to happen because you're not going to win. We'll see, Kael said quietly. The crowd began to disperse, conversations buzzing with speculation about the upcoming fight. Kael caught fragments as wolves passed, some betting on Garrett's victory, others expressing admiration for Kael's courage even while predicting his defeat, still others angry that an Omega would dare challenge pack hierarchy so publicly. When most of the crowd had cleared, Lena appeared at Kael's side. "Have you lost your mind?" she demanded. "Garrett's going to tear you apart." "Maybe, but at least I'll go down fighting." Kael managed a weak smile. "Besides, Rhaegar's going to train me. I might surprise everyone." "You'll surprise everyone by surviving more than 30 seconds, Lena muttered. But her eyes were proud. "You're the bravest idiot I've ever met, Kael Brennan, and I'm honored to call you my friend." The next 3 days were the most physically demanding of Kael's life. Rhaegar woke him before dawn each morning and dragged him to a private training room deep in the pack house, a space reserved for the Alpha family's personal use, equipped with weapons, practice dummies, and enough open floor space for combat drills. "Forget everything you think you know about fighting," Rhaegar had said on the first day. "We're not training you to be an honorable warrior. We're training you to survive against an opponent who has every physical advantage. That means fighting dirty." And fight dirty they did. Rhaegar taught Kael how to use speed and agility to avoid direct hits, how to target vulnerable spots, eyes, throat, knees, groin, how to turn an opponent's momentum against them, how to feint and dodge and strike when the opening appeared. "You're never going to win a contest of raw strength," Rhaegar explained as he demonstrated a particularly vicious move that involved using an opponent's own weight to flip them. "So don't even try. Make him chase you. Tire him out, let him get frustrated and sloppy, then exploit every mistake." Kael absorbed it all, his body aching and bruised from repeated throws and strikes. But he could feel himself improving, getting faster, more confident, learning to trust his instincts and his smaller size as advantages rather than weaknesses. On the second day, Rhaegar brought in a beta-ranked wolf to serve as a sparring partner, someone closer to Garrett's size and strength. The sparring sessions were brutal. Kael lost every single match, but each time he lasted a little longer, landed a few more hits, managed to avoid a few more devastating blows. "You're getting better," Rhaegar said after one particularly intense session left Kael gasping on the training room floor. "Your reflexes are improving. You're starting to think like a fighter instead of a victim." "I still can't beat him," Kael panted. "Maybe not in a straight fight, but you don't need to beat him. You just need to prove you belong." Rhaegar extended a hand and pulled Kael to his feet. "Show the pack that Omegas can fight back, that you're not weak just because you were born with a different designation. That's the real victory." On the third day, the day before the challenge, Rhaegar changed tactics. Instead of physical training, he took Kael to his private study and spread out a detailed analysis of Garrett's fighting style. "I've been watching him," Rhaegar explained. "He fights for Victor's border patrols, so there are records of his combat techniques. He's strong and aggressive, but he has patterns. He favors his right side. He telegraphs his big strikes with a slight shoulder dip. And he has terrible ground defense. If you can get him down, he struggles to protect himself." Kael studied the notes, committing every detail to memory. "So the strategy is to stay mobile, wait for him to telegraph a big strike, dodge it, and try to take him to the ground?" "Essentially. And once he's down, you go for submission holds. Make him tap out or pass out. Don't try to trade blows. You'll lose that exchange every time." It was a solid plan, maybe even a workable plan, but both of them knew it was still a long shot. That evening, as the sun set over the pack territory and painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, Rhaegar and Kael stood together on one of the pack house balconies. "Are you scared?" Rhaegar asked quietly. "Terrified," Kael admitted. "I've never been in a real fight. I've spent my whole life avoiding confrontation, and now I'm walking into a challenge against a trained warrior who wants to humiliate me in front of the entire pack. You could still withdraw. There's no shame in— Yes, there is. Kale's hands gripped the balcony railing. Not shame from you or from wolves who respect me, but shame from myself. If I back down now, I'll always wonder if I could have done it, if I could have proven that Omegas aren't weak, that I'm not weak. Rhaegar was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "When I look at you, Kyle, I don't see weakness. I see one of the strongest wolves I've ever met. You survived a murder accusation. You fought for justice when it would have been easier to give up. You stood beside me in the Grand Court and claimed space that Omegas have been denied for generations. You're already extraordinary. You don't need to prove anything to anyone." "Maybe not to anyone else," Kale said softly, "but I need to prove it to myself." Rhaegar turned to face him fully, his golden eyes intense in the fading light. "Then tomorrow, you'll walk into that challenge with your head high, and win or lose, you'll show the pack what real courage looks like." He leaned in slowly, giving Kale time to pull away if he wanted. Kale didn't pull away. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and fierce all at once. A promise and a confession, everything they'd been dancing around for days, finally acknowledged in a single moment of connection. When they pulled apart, Rhaegar rested his forehead against Kale's. "Whatever happens tomorrow," the Alpha Heir whispered, "know that you changed me. Changed how I see the pack, how I see leadership, how I see what's possible. You matter, Kale, more than you know." "You changed me too," Kale said. "You made me believe I could be more than what the pack told me I was." They stood together as darkness fell, two wolves facing an uncertain future. Connected by something that defied pack tradition and hierarchy, and every rule they'd been raised to follow, tomorrow would bring violence and judgment and the ultimate test of Kyle's courage. But tonight, in this moment, they had each other. And sometimes that was enough. Chapter 10. I Bow to No Alpha. Dawn arrived cold and merciless. Kyle stood at the edge of the training grounds, watching the sun creep above the mountains while the pack assembled around the combat circle. Hundreds of wolves had turned out to witness the challenge, far more than he'd expected. Word had spread that an Omega was fighting a Beta for the right to stand beside the Alpha Heir, and apparently that was entertainment too compelling to miss. Some faces in the crowd were supportive. Lena stood near the front, her expression fierce and worried. A handful of other Omegas had gathered together, watching with a mixture of hope and fear. Even a few Alphas and Betas wore expressions that suggested they were curious to see if Kyle could actually pull this off. But most of the crowd looked hungry. Eager to see the uppity Omega put in his place, ready to watch him bleed and break and learn the lesson he should have learned from birth, that wolves like him didn't challenge wolves like Garrett. Garrett himself stood on the opposite side of the combat circle, rolling his massive shoulders and cracking his knuckles. He wore simple fighting clothes that displayed his heavily muscled frame. Scars crisscrossed his arms and chest, evidence of years of border skirmishes and pack challenges. He looked like what he was, a warrior born and bred, comfortable with violence, confident in his inevitable victory. Kyle wore similar fighting clothes, but on his smaller frame, they hung differently. He looked exactly like what he was, an Omega Forge worker who'd spent 3 days learning to fight and was about to face someone with a lifetime of combat experience. The odds were laughably bad. But Kyle had never let bad odds stop him before. "Combatants, approach the center," Alpha Caster commanded from his position at the edge of the circle. Kale walked forward on steady legs. Garrett swaggered, his confidence absolute. They stopped 3 feet apart, and Kale got his first real sense of the size difference. Garrett towered over him by at least 6 inches, outweighed him by 60 pounds of pure muscle, had reach advantages that would make landing clean hits nearly impossible. "Last chance to back out, Omega," Garrett said quietly enough that only Kyle could hear. "Save yourself the humiliation. Admit you don't belong beside the Alpha Heir, and I'll make this quick. Painful, but quick." Kale met his eyes without flinching. "I'm not backing out, and I'm not afraid of you." Garrett's smile turned cruel. "You should be." "The challenge is issued and accepted," Castor declared, his voice carrying across the assembled pack. "The combat will continue until one combatant yields, is rendered unconscious, or is unable to continue. The victor's claim will be recognized by the pack. There are no other rules. Begin when ready." Castor stepped back, leaving them alone in the circle. The crowd fell silent, hundreds of wolves watching, waiting. Garrett didn't waste time with posturing. He came at KL immediately, fast for a wolf his size, his right fist driving forward in a straight punch aimed at KL's face. But Rhaegar had been right about the telegraph. That tiny shoulder dip gave KL just enough warning. He twisted aside, feeling the massive fist pass inches from his jaw, and drove his own fist toward Garrett's exposed ribs. The hit landed, but it was like punching stone. Garrett barely flinched. "Going to have to hit harder than that, Omega," Garrett growled, spinning with surprising speed and launching a kick at KL's midsection. This time, KL wasn't fast enough. The kick caught him in the side, lifting him off his feet and sending him crashing to the ground. Pain exploded through his ribs. His vision hazed. The crowd roared, some in triumph, others in dismay. KL forced himself to roll away, just as Garrett's boot came down where his head had been a second before. He scrambled to his feet, his side screaming in protest. His breathing already labored. 3 seconds into the fight and he was already hurt. This was going to be bad. "Stay mobile," Rhaegar's voice echoed in his memory. "Don't let him pin you. Don't let him land clean hits. Move, dodge, survive." KL circled, keeping his distance, watching for patterns. Garrett came at him again, throwing a combination of punches that KL barely avoided. One caught him in the shoulder. Not a clean hit, but enough to spin him partially around. He used the momentum, converting it into a low kick aimed at Garrett's knee. The strike connected solidly, and Garrett grunted in pain, his leg buckling slightly. First blood. Not literal blood, but the first real damage KL had managed to inflict. "Lucky shot," Garrett snarled, favoring the leg slightly as he advanced again. But KL had learned something crucial. Garrett could be hurt. He wasn't invincible, and that leg was now a weakness to exploit. They exchanged blows for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. KL took more hits than he landed, his body accumulating damage, bruises blooming across his ribs and arms and face. But he stayed mobile, kept moving, refused to let Garrett pin him or land the kind of devastating strike that would end the fight immediately. And slowly, Garrett began to slow. The bigger wolf was strong, but strength required energy. All those heavy punches and powerful kicks were exhausting. Meanwhile, KL's lighter frame meant he could move more efficiently, conserve energy, wait for openings. "You're just delaying the inevitable," Garrett panted, sweat pouring down his face. "Eventually, you'll make a mistake. And when you do, I'll break you." "Maybe," KL gasped, his own breathing ragged. "Or maybe you'll make a mistake first." They circled each other, both bloodied now, both exhausted. The crowd had gone from roaring excitement to tense silence, realizing that this fight wasn't the quick humiliation they'd expected. The Omega was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to submit. Garrett charged forward with a roar, throwing caution aside, clearly intending to end this with one massive strike. His right fist came up in a haymaker punch that carried all his remaining strength, and KL saw the opening. Instead of dodging backward, he stepped into the punch, getting inside Garrett's guard. The massive fist passed over his shoulder as KL drove his own fist into Garrett's solar plexus. Not hard, but precise, hitting the nerve cluster that would temporarily paralyze the diaphragm. Garrett's eyes went wide. His breath left him in a whoosh. He stumbled, gasping, his hands dropping to his stomach. And KL swept his injured leg. Garrett went down hard, his back hitting the ground with a heavy thud that made the crowd gasp collectively. "Ground defense," Rhaegar had said. "He's terrible at it." KL didn't give him time to recover. He was on Garrett in an instant, using his lighter weight to his advantage, getting his arm around the bigger wolf's throat in a chokehold that cut off blood flow to the brain. Garrett thrashed, his superior strength coming back online as his breathing recovered. He bucked and rolled, trying to dislodge Kale. His hands clawed at Kale's arm, strong enough to leave bruises, possibly to break bones if Kale let go. But Kale didn't let go. He locked his legs around Garrett's torso, anchoring himself, and squeezed. Not crushing the windpipe. That would be lethal, but compressing the carotid arteries on either side of the neck. A blood choke. The kind that would render Garrett unconscious in seconds if Kyle could just hold on. "Submit," Kale gritted out through clenched teeth. "Just submit and this ends." Garrett's response was to throw himself backward, slamming Kale into the ground. Pain exploded through Kale's already injured ribs. His vision went white at the edges, but he didn't let go. Couldn't let go. This was it. This was his only chance. Garrett's struggles began to weaken. His clawing became less coordinated. His body went from thrashing violently to jerky twitches. The crowd was screaming now, some urging Garrett to break free, others shouting for Kale to hold on, everyone recognizing they were witnessing something unprecedented, an Omega choking out a Beta in single combat. Garrett's hand came up, slapping weakly at Kale's arm. Once, twice, the traditional signal of submission. Kale held on for one more heartbeat, making sure it wasn't a trick, making sure Garrett was truly yielding. Then he released the choke and rolled away, his body screaming in protest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Garrett lay on the ground, coughing and gasping, his hands still raised in submission. Silence fell over the training grounds. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Alpha Caster's voice rang out, cold and clear and undeniable. "The Omega is victorious. The challenge is decided." The silence shattered. Half the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. The other half stood in stunned disbelief, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. Lena was jumping up and down, screaming Kale's name. The cluster of Omegas looked like they'd just watched the moon herself descend from the sky. And Rhaegar had vaulted over the barrier and was crossing the combat circle in long strides, his face blazing with pride and relief, and something else. Something fierce and possessive and completely inappropriate for an alpha heir to feel toward an Omega. He didn't care. Rhaegar dropped to his knees beside Kale and pulled him into an embrace that made the watching crowd gasp and murmur even louder. "You did it," Rhaegar breathed against Kale's ear. "You actually did it." "Barely," Kale gasped, every part of his body throbbing with pain. "Pretty sure he broke at least 2 of my ribs." "Worth it?" Kale pulled back enough to look into Rhaegar's golden eyes. "Completely." Across the circle, Garrett had managed to sit up, still coughing, his hand pressed to his throat. When his eyes focused on Kale, they held something unexpected. Not hatred or resentment, but grudging respect. "You fight dirty," Garrett rasped. "You fight traditional," Kale replied. "I couldn't beat you at your own game, so I changed the game." Garrett laughed, a rough, painful sound. "Fair enough." He looked at Alpha Caster. "I yield the challenge. The Omega's claim to stand beside the Alpha heir is recognized, and," he grimaced, clearly hating every word, "as agreed, I'll advocate before the Council for better treatment of Omega-ranked wolves. Starting tomorrow." "Starting today," Caster corrected, his cold eyes sweeping across the assembled pack, "because what we've witnessed here demands immediate response. An Omega just defeated a trained Beta warrior in single combat, not through luck, not through deception, through strategy, courage, and sheer determination. That suggests our assumptions about rank and capability may need serious reconsideration." He stepped into the circle, his commanding presence drawing every eye. For generations, this pack has operated under the belief that strength is determined by designation, that alphas are inherently superior, betas are capable, and omegas are weak. But Kale Brennan has proven that belief false. He survived a murder accusation through intelligence. He exposed a conspiracy through investigation, and he defended his right to respect through combat. Those are not the actions of a weak wolf. Those are the actions of a wolf who simply hasn't been given the opportunity to show his worth. Castor's gaze found Kyle. You ask the pack to remember that you nearly died because you were convenient to blame, to remember that justice requires looking past rank and seeing individuals. Consider that lesson remembered, and consider it the beginning of change. From this day forward, Castor declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the training grounds, Cale Brennan is elevated to the rank of Beta, with all rights and privileges that designation carries. Furthermore, he is appointed as special advisor to the Alpha Heir on matters of justice and pack reform. And anyone who questions his right to stand beside my son will answer to me personally. The pronouncement hit like a thunderclap. Beta rank, advisor to the heir, official recognition and protection from the Alpha himself. It was more than Cale had dreamed possible. I don't want special treatment, Cale said, his voice still rough from exertion. I just want fairness, for all Omegas, for every wolf who's been told they're worth less because of the rank they were born with. Then help us build that fairness, Castor replied. Work with my son, reform the laws that need reforming, challenge the traditions that need challenging, be the change you demanded. Cale looked around the training grounds, at the Omegas watching with tears in their eyes, at the Betas and Alphas whose expressions ranged from respect to resentment, at Garrett who was nodding slowly in acknowledgement of his defeat and his new obligation, and at Rhaegar, who stood beside him with fierce pride and something that looked a lot like love blazing in his golden eyes. I'll try, Cale said finally. I can't promise I'll succeed. I can't promise I won't make mistakes or that change will come easily, but I'll try. That's all anyone can ask, Castor said. Then, in a softer voice meant only for Kyle and Rhaegar, you've given my son something I never could. Hope that the pack can be better than it has been. Don't waste that gift. The Alpha turned and strode from the training grounds, his guards falling into step behind him. The crowd began to disperse, conversations buzzing with speculation and debate about what they'd witnessed and what it meant for the pack's future. But Kyle and Rhaegar remained in the center of the combat circle, the morning sun climbing higher, painting everything in shades of gold. Beta rank, Kyle said wonderingly, advisor to the heir. How did this become my life? You fought for it, Rhaegar said simply. You refused to accept the limitations the pack tried to put on you. You stood up when it would have been easier to stay down. You changed everything, Cale. We changed everything, Cale corrected. I couldn't have done any of this without you believing in me first. Rhaegar's hand found his, their fingers intertwining, no longer hiding or apologizing for the connection between them. Then let's keep changing things, the Alpha Heir said softly, together, as partners, as equals. Regardless of what any wolf thinks about an Alpha and a former Omega choosing each other. I bow to no Alpha, Cale said, the words that had been building inside him since that first night in the detention cell finally finding voice. Not out of disrespect, but because I've learned that submission isn't the same as respect, that obedience isn't the same as loyalty, and that true strength comes from standing on your own feet, not kneeling at someone else's. Rhaegar's smile was brilliant and fierce. Then stand beside me, not beneath me, not behind me, beside me. Help me lead this pack toward something better than what we've been. Always, Cale promised, and in that moment, with the sun rising and the pack beginning a new chapter, and two wolves who'd found each other against all odds, standing together in the combat circle where one had proven his worth, the future felt full of impossible possibilities. The fight was over, but the real work, the work of changing hearts and minds and centuries of tradition, was just beginning. And Cale Brennan, former Omega, current Beta, and Wolf, who'd refused to accept the fate the pack tried to give him, was ready for the challenge. Epilogue. 6 months later. The council chamber had never held this many Omegas before. Cale stood at the front of the room beside Rhaegar, looking out at the assembled wolves who'd come to present their proposals for pack reform. What had started as a small advisory committee had grown into a full movement, omegas, betas, and even a few progressive alphas working together to reshape how the Moonshadow Pack treated its lowest-ranked members. Educational programs, merit-based advancement opportunities, protection from exploitation and abuse, representation in pack decision-making. It was ambitious, revolutionary even, and it was working. "The Council recognizes Marta Cortez," Castor announced from his seat at the head of the chamber. Marta stepped forward. No longer the terrified servant who'd lied under coercion, but a confident advocate who'd found her voice. "I'm proposing a formal witness protection program. Wolves who come forward with information about crimes or corruption should have guaranteed safety for themselves and their families. No one should have to choose between justice and their loved one's well-being." The council members conferred quietly, then nodded their approval. "The proposal is accepted. Work with Beta Brennan to draft the formal policy." Beta Brennan. Cale still wasn't entirely used to the title, even after 6 months. But he wore it with growing confidence, using his position to push for the changes he'd once only dreamed about. The meeting continued for another hour, proposal after proposal being presented, debated, and mostly approved. The pack was changing. Slowly with resistance from traditionalists, but changing nonetheless. When the session finally concluded, Cale and Rhaegar walked together through the pack house corridors toward their shared quarters. Another change that had raised eyebrows, but that Castor had approved without comment. "Your father's going to make you alpha soon," Cale said. It wasn't a question. The signs were obvious. Castor was gradually transferring more responsibilities to Rhaegar, preparing him for leadership. "Probably within the year," Rhaegar agreed. "He wants to ensure the reforms are solidified before the transition. Make sure they can't be easily undone by whoever comes after me." "And when you're alpha," Kael asked, "what happens to us?" Rhaegar stopped walking, turning to face Cale fully. "When I'm alpha, I'm going to officially name you as my mate, my partner, my equal, and if the pack has a problem with an alpha choosing a former omega, they can challenge me for leadership." Cale's breath caught. "You'd risk your position for you, for us, for the principle that wolves should be able to choose their own mates based on love and respect, not rank and politics." Rhaegar's golden eyes blazed with determination. "I bow to no outdated tradition, Kael, and I won't let the pack's prejudices dictate who I love." Love. They danced around the word for months, both feeling it but neither quite brave enough to say it aloud. Until now. "I love you too," Cale said softly, "even though it's terrifying and complicated and probably going to make both our lives harder." "Especially because of all that," Rhaegar said with a smile. "We've never done things the easy way. Why start now?" They continued walking, their hands linked, their future uncertain, but facing it together. Behind them, the pack moved forward into a new era, an era where rank didn't determine worth, where omegas could become betas, and betas could advise alphas, and alphas could choose their mates based on love rather than politics, where a wolf who'd once been condemned to die had instead helped transform everything, where courage and justice had proven stronger than tradition and prejudice. The revolution wasn't complete. There would be setbacks and opposition, wolves who clung to the old ways, challenges to overcome. But for the first time in the Moonshadow Pack's long history, change felt possible. And it had all started with 3 words spoken in defiance: "I bow to no alpha." Dear viewers, now that we've reached the end of Kael's story, here's what I can't stop thinking about. Cale was chained, condemned, and the entire pack wanted him dead for something he didn't do. He had every reason to give up, but he didn't. So my question is this: was that courage, or just desperation refusing to die? And be honest with yourself. If you were in his place, with the whole world against you and no one believing your truth, would you have kept fighting, or would you have accepted your fate? I need to know. Drop your answer in the comments, and please don't forget to like this video.